Welcome everyone to Unsafe Space. You're watching Deprogrammed, which is normally hosted by me and the very lovely Keri Smith. Keri, say hello to the audience.
Hi, Carter. Hi, if it's your first time here, Deprogrammed is a show that we do most often with interviews where we talk to people about my old ideology. I most often call it social justice ideology, but it's got a lot of different names that people refer to it by. We are really excited. We have a very special guest today. He's a returning guest, returning champion
Yes.
of
So
Unsafe Space.
yeah. So we're welcoming back James Lindsay. James is the founder and president of New Discourses. NewDiscourses.com. You can go there, which is an educational and media resources platform currently dedicated to explaining and helping people understand the critical social justice scholarship and worldview, which does not sound like a fun thing to understand, but necessary. He's the best-selling author of 6 books and countless essays, including most recently "How to Have Impossible Conversations," which he wrote with Peter Boghossian, and an upcoming book, Cynical Theories, which he's authored with Helen Pluckrose. He's known for his participation in the Grievance Studies Affair back in 2018. You can follow him on Twitter at Conceptual James, and you can go to newdiscourses.com. I will also put links to both the Cynical Theories, the Grievance Study Affairs, and How to Have Impossible Conversations in the show notes, so you guys can check it out. But with that said, James, welcome.
Hey, thanks, King.
You sound like a busy man.
We were talking beforehand, James.
Yeah.
Yeah, my schedule has become a torment. I'm to the point where I feel like Frodo walking toward the mountain of doom, and it's like I can see the ring with my waking eye, a wheel of fire. And it's like it's so much to do right now. It's really intense.
Well,
so we were talking about that a little beforehand, and I'm going to repeat some of that just because I reached out to you this time because I have nowhere near the number of followers that you do. Our show isn't quite that big yet, although we just passed a milestone, yay. But we're getting more in the past month since this ideology's gone mainstream. I'm getting a lot more messages from people. I'm getting a lot of messages from parents in particular whose children are starting to speak some of what I call the magic words, like the phrases of woke ideology. And a lot of these messages are almost desperate sounding and like, how do I talk to my kid but not push them away? And so I wanted to talk to you and see what's it been like for you this month? What kind of messages are you getting? You can see, what's the quote you use from Lord of the Rings?
It's like you can see the wheel of fire with your waking eye or something like that.
So tell me what the wheel of fire looks like based on your inbox.
People are freaking out. People have realized that some big change that's far more significant and incomprehensible than they had realized is broken loose. And they're shocked by the quickness with which people seem to be taking it up. Like you identified the magic words thing. So my inbox for the first couple of weeks after George Floyd died was like this ocean of people saying, by the way, James, this is now in my, whatever walk of life, whether it's family, whether it's especially workplaces, academic department, school, whatever. For like 2 weeks, I got so many examples sent to me as like, hey, guess what they're saying at where I work? Like, I know. Literally everybody is sending me this, and it's at every place of work. And then it kind of started to evolve into more personal stories of people panicking and talking to me about how the kind of woke ideology is kind of cracking into and ruining aspects of their personal lives. So the work life thing still continues. I'm still getting, it's calmed down a little bit for whatever set of reasons. I'm still getting probably 1,000 messages or more a week of these kinds of storytelling. Wow. Confession or begging for help is always the punchline at the end. And even so, they're hard to differentiate one from another because there's so many. It feels like it's the same story with slightly different details. Whether it's somebody's children have started to say this and have denounced their parents. I had somebody send me something yesterday saying that it feels like, or maybe it was this morning, and time is also blurring together, but send me a note saying that her sister has taken this stuff up, and recently they had, the other day, a family gathering for the first time in a little while, And her sister, she said the feeling was, it was like she was looking straight through us, like we weren't there or that we weren't human. And is all woke now, and it's all wokeness stuff. And all she does is these Instagram campaigns to raise money to throw at Black Lives Matter and other woke charities, but somehow is managing to pull down like 6 figures off of that herself as, you know, her portion. And then I'm hearing from interracial couples, or I was for a while a lot, hearing from interracial couples that are telling me about how one of the, whichever partner is lower on the oppression status hierarchy, is being beleaguered by the one that has more oppression status. And like suddenly you have people married 15 years and it's, well, you've always been kind of racist. And it's like, well, you know me, I'm not racist, blah, blah, blah. We've been together 15 years. And then the person's like, well, 15 years isn't really long enough to know somebody where it comes to something like this. And it's like, that's messed up. And then I'm hearing from people whose therapy sessions with their therapists, if they're cross-racial, have just turned into like struggle sessions about white supremacy and white complicity, even to the point where people are talking about how they're in therapy to work through the trauma of having been raped by, say, Black men. And then with a Black therapist, and we're talking about a white woman in this particular case I'm thinking of, she was gang raped by several Black men at once. And the therapist knows why she chose a Black male therapist as part of to work through the struggle. They've been together for a few years, successful. And then all of a sudden, after George Floyd died, it's all of a sudden, you know, she said she's talking through whatever it is. And then you're at this moment, you know, and it's like, well, you know, I haven't had the best track record, you know, experience with Black men. So I have these issues. And then the therapist is like, cuts her off and is like, no, you need to understand the systemic nature of racism and what would lead people to be in positions like that. We're not going to blame Black men. Like at the moment of that vulnerability in a therapy session. And then I'm getting emails from people to my favorite ones. I mean, it's grim. I'm not favorite in the sense like, it's like I'm happy, but it really shows what's going on. Are people who are writing to me about their workplaces that had brown fragility or white fragility or something, or some gay sensitivity, some odd training that they're all forcing everybody to have now. And they're like, I got along with my colleagues before and everything was really good. And, you know, we worked together well and it seemed like a pretty functional office. Nothing's perfect, you know, little scuffles here and there. But then all of a sudden it's like they decided we had to have this training. And so they take us and like all like the brown people have to sit there and every white person in the room is now forced to explain how they're racist to us. So all of our coworkers are now like telling us that they're racist all the time. Or in the case where it's across like a sexuality thing, it's like all these people are like, I've never admitted it to you, but I secretly hate gay people. Like now that's a really comfortable office to work in. Wow. And then it's like they start with the sexuality ones. It's crazy because then it's like for weeks afterwards or days afterwards, it's like they come to my office all day long and apologize for how their religion makes it so they hate gay people, but they're trying to be cool and understand. So now it's like they start asking really prying and probing questions about their sex lives all day long. And it's like, holy crap, like how is this helping
how
people?
Do they get any work done?
Well, I mean, they don't. That's the other thing. That's the thing actually that really needs to be understood, that this is like the most navel-gazing, narcissistic void ideology that I've ever seen in my life. It's like definitely designed to make people look for their self-pity. And they say that stuff is only being authentically done if you're constantly looking at the issues like racism or whatever. So nobody gets any work done. Everybody just has to talk about social issues that didn't exist 2 weeks ago constantly. And nobody's getting any work done. I even saw a scientist tweet a couple of weeks ago saying that I think it's like a nuclear medicine scientist or a nuclear engineering scientist, something important. And they were like, I feel like it's inappropriate to even do any work. We should only be our regular work. We should only be doing anti-racism work at this time. Wow. And it's like, so all these people now are asking me like, what do I do with my workplace? And I'm like, quit and go start something similar with your talent, because the thing you left can't compete and you're going to destroy them. In 6 months, you're going to have all of their customers because they can't compete because they're going to just be mired in arguing about racism and sexism and homophobia and trans stuff all the time. And just don't let it into your new company you start. Quit and start your own thing.
That's what I think is going to happen with the churches, because it's infiltrated. As you know, it's been moving into churches for a while, and which fascinates me as a new Christian, having left that ideology, having left that religion of wokeness, and then to find it in the church. And in the past month, just like it's ramped up everywhere, it's now infiltrating my old church. And people are asking me, should I stay in the church and fight? Or my feeling on it is, I mean, I'm all for anybody who wants to fight it, but I kind of feel like once it's in and it's going to converge upon the whole place, like it's going to fail. People are going to leave the church because that's not why they came there, is to be in a constant identity politics, struggle session. And so they're going to go looking for an alternative. So provide the alternative.
That's exactly right. And what will happen is they'll say, oh, we're the Justice Church. And that's the chauvinist, sexist, racist, or whatever church. And then what people will end up having to do is say, well, all right, if that's what you say. And because the inflation on the moral currency of this stuff is out of control. And so it used to be like, calling somebody a racist was like dropping $1,000 on the table, but it's going to be like Zimbabwe bucks before you know it. You're going to have, you're going to need like a wheelbarrow of tears rather than a mug of tears or whatever, or even a single crocodile tear to get anybody's sympathy. And so it's true. People, this ideology is a universal solvent, and it has matured to the point where it literally can and will dissolve anything that lets it in. And so the solution to that, I was telling people until quite recently that they should, you don't want to abandon, they want you to quit, etc. And I literally was just advising somebody that I know who works in one of these major journalistic outlets. My advice was quit, brain drain the place. Everybody who's competent, brain drain it. Turn them into, I said, hold them to the fire of Keith's Law. Keith's Law is the political science law that the more political a thing is perceived to be, the less credible it is. And so let them, like, okay, that's the new woke times. Okay, fine. And we're going to bail and we're going to go do something different, and whatever it is. And it's not going to be comfortable at first. And it's nobody's going to be able to compete if they're constantly engaging in struggle sessions all the time. And people will, the number of emails that I get right now from people who are like, I'm scared to lose my job, blah, blah, blah. It just tells me that if there was another job they could go to, they would in a heartbeat. So it's now time to start building those things and just brain drain everything that wants to be woke and see how long they stay woke. Corporations won't stay woke if they get brain drained. Yeah. They'll be like, whoa, we're losing all of our talent. What do we do? I know, let's get rid of this garbage. And they'll actually start firing the people who are problem causers, because that's what was happening to them before. They were getting fired here and there, but very carefully, for causing problems in the workplace and usually not being very diligent workers. Those things seem to be going hand in hand.
Do you think that will really happen, though? Because if the board of directors level is truly woke, I'm thinking of like a publicly traded company. If the board is actually truly woke, then their stock price is not the measure by which they will measure success of the company. And so they might be willing to just self-immolate the entire way down.
That's kind of, some of them will, and that's okay too.
We can party.
That's why somebody needs to be, exactly. Somebody needs to start just making the alternatives. I saw Lisa Bildy, who was very successful at doing a pushback effort in a Canadian Law Society, talking about it the other day on Twitter. She did fight back, and she actually won the fight that she was pushing back. And she said now that she's moved entirely away from fighting, and now it's just the objective to build new things that aren't invested in this garbage. Yeah. And she says that's the next wave, and I think she's right. And the sooner people start latching onto it, the better. It's like time to rebuild a society that's uncancelable.
Yeah, we've talked about this before. Like if you're not explicitly anti this ideology, you will fall to it. But you have a unique background that I want to tap into a little bit, because you've read. I think a lot of people are wondering what happened, because for a lot of people this seems like it suddenly happened, right? And it did in some sense, but there was a groundwork that was laid everywhere, and it was pretty extensive groundwork. Can you talk about why that is, so people can understand that, like, people did not go from sudden, like, Enlightenment individualists in February to, super woke anti-individualist Marxists in July? That's not what happened.
No, it's not. I mean, there's a number of ways we could try to approach that point. Of course, it's a very difficult point to communicate. I've been trying to communicate it for years and not succeeding. So maybe this won't work, but we'll try. The filmmaker who's been working with us about the Grievance Studies Affair and is making a full-length documentary on it has a metaphor about trees. And he says, you can think of society as living in the canopy of a tree, and the tree that we've implanted for the entire of the modern era is like the liberal tree. And, Enlightenment liberalism, when I say that, I mean like Scottish liberalism and science. So what was stuck into the American experiment, the Constitution and Bill of Rights and Declaration are examples of founding documents in that line of thought. So we've all lived in the liberal tree, and the liberal tree has a number of expectations. People know what living in that tree is like. We have to accept criticism from people to a degree. We try to give people the benefit of the doubt in their argument. We try to not be unduly rude to people, although rudeness is allowed. We try to hold a ethic of not being unfairly rude to people. We try to minimize things like discrimination and so on. So there's certain rules, and everybody's comfortable living in this tree, and it has this fruit. Well, in the last 100 years, starting with a couple of, you basically kind of ended up having a handful of sort of mad scientists, genetic engineers in the tree who started to build a genetically modified version of the liberal tree that we could call critical social justice. Now, some of the earlier experiments were called critical theory. Later, they developed postmodernism. And I would say that the postmodern side is in some ways more indicative of how we need to describe the thing going forward, even though critical theory is the solvent, the powerful engine that's the problem. And so they planted this postmodern tree next to the modern tree that its canopy is liberalism. And they engineered it so that it would look very similar and grow very closely, literally parasitically, off of the liberal tree. And so now this thing has been growing since the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and has got to the point, and with the critical theory back to the 1920s. So this thing has grown to a fully mature tree. It's producing fruit. The fruit looks similar to the liberal tree. And so people who lived in the liberal tree have been kind of going back and forth between the two twin canopies, not really realizing that there's two cultures happening at once. So they've taken in a lot of this other culture, eaten a lot of that fruit, got the sap in their veins, if you will. Kind of, this is all like an elaborate metaphor. But the idea is that there is a mimic, a very cuckoo bird kind of mimic of liberalism that is this critical infused postmodernism, or if you want postmodern infused critical, it's the same thing. That's what the critical social justice thing is. And it imitates the various aspects of liberal society while actually being against those. So it's trying to supplant those with its own. And so people have taken up a lot of the tenets that it's been teaching very slowly. Like, well, don't you think the United States has been a little bit too aggressive with its military? Don't you think it's been a bit imperial? What happens if we look at our colonial past? Like, look at Christopher Columbus. Like, we think he's been this great hero. We got fed this story about what a great hero he is, but look at all this awful stuff he did. And then when we look at the way that the American continent was covered, don't you see how we've been lied to in all of our schooling? And so people have picked up, like, they're having the big theme of the past, like most of my life, has been everything you've ever known was wrong. And they've been fed this kind of steady diet of the way it's been wrong is this rose-colored glasses story. And so the real story is this gross, gritty, unfair, cheating, critical, cynical story that's been left out of the American mythology. And a lot of people have, especially on the left, have imbibed of this critical cynicism, taking up these lines of thought like, well, maybe different groups do have different knowledge. Maybe it really is hard to get to objective truth. Maybe the science isn't the best way to know everything. And these kind of very pessimistic, barely kind of true narratives or partially true narratives have really infiltrated a lot of people's thinking, not least because this started to be mainlined into teacher colleges as early as 1980. So we've been teaching our teachers to teach our children this way for going on 3 or 4 decades now. So more and more and more of this kind of thought has been getting into how the younger generations in particular think. And then older leftists will have picked up quite a bit of it, unless they're Marxists, because Marxists see it as a bourgeois plot to steal the working class away from the left. Or maybe I said that backwards, or steal the left away from the working class. And they're right about that. So pretty much everybody else, though, has kind of like, yeah, we really have been awful to black people throughout all of our history, and really we probably need to make up for that. So this white guilt kind of very cynical view, wow, it's like only just in my own lifetime that we saw civil rights advances for gay people to where they can get married. Never mind that queer theory, which is the critical social justice analysis of this, was vehemently opposed to gay marriage and is still vehemently opposed to gay marriage. They don't know that. They just see this kind of like rainbow coalition blockade thing, and it's all the same good movement trying to increase people's fair rights. So it's been preying upon and playing upon people's best impulses of fairness and charity of argument and all of this, while churning out decades, reams and reams and reams and decades of scholarship that nobody's been criticizing properly. And this is not new. It's like you could think that what's happening is that there's been like a crocodile coming up very, very slowly out of the water with its mouth wide open, wide open, wide open, wide open, wide open. And then the right moment in history came, George Floyd died, and jaws snapped. And that's where we are right now. So the crocodile's been coming up real slow, real silent, real careful for a long time with its mouth and its teeth right there. And then the moment arose in history that bam, they tried to snap the jaws. And so very rapidly, people's guilt is being played upon. And it's now kind of, we've mentioned your experience as a new Christian, so maybe you can even talk to that. There's a tendency with people who are picking up some new definition. I'm going to very, very vaguely speak about religion as for the average, not that engaged person. Religion is that what you do to be a good person, to feel like you are a good person and to find out how to be a good person. So now you have this whole new definition of what it means to be a good person, and you're starting to get very rapid converts. And at the same time, nobody wants to be the person who's on the wrong side of it. Nobody quite understands it. And so you're having a mass conversion kind of in the lightest sense. Like, for example, a friend of mine wrote to me and said that her kids were kind of getting into all of this stuff. And then she decided to, step in and talk to them and say, well, what do you mean by that? And then their answers are like, I don't know, everybody's saying it. Yeah. That's it.
That's not
I don't know what it means, but I'm repeating it. That's what good people do. All the good people now, all the people I care about are saying this. So this is what I say now too. I care about this too. I'm into this too. And so we're at this weird inflection point then where I don't think the ideology has set for a lot of people, but a lot of people have now taken the first step into it. And I mean a lot, like maybe 30 or 40% of the population.
Yeah.
The way I think of it is we've talked about this on the show, is that it's you talk about the crocodile rising up slowly. I also kind of viewed it as there are all these people who were the seeds were planted a long time ago, and maybe they weren't people who paid attention to anything sociopolitical. Maybe they're the type of person who spends all their time online, Instagramming and Facebooking about how they have the perfect family. That's the measure by which they show they're a good person. Or maybe it's their church or whatever it is. They're signaling their virtue based on having a great family life and going to the right church. Maybe those people have imbibed some of these beliefs without even realizing it. And now it's like what happened with the George Floyd event, and it could have been any event. That one is just that one took. And those people were like, it's almost like Manchurian Candidate. I think they were all activated. Like the switch came on. It's like, okay, now you have to prove that you're a good person. Now you have to start speaking it. You can't just believe some of this stuff, accept a few of the tenets here and there. Now you have to pledge your allegiance publicly. You need to start having the difficult conversation with your family. You need to post the right things online. And so Carter and I have talked about this. We both know people who it went from being their online presence was pretty not shallow, but just sort of about what their life was like in their family life, or maybe here's my breakfast, shopping, whatever. And now it's constant social justice signaling.
Yep. That's probably exactly correct.
can you talk a little bit about, I heard part of your Rogan interview. Amazing. I'm so happy you went on that show. I saw it had over 2 million views last I looked at it. I'm happy people are hearing this. One of the things you said that I loved, and I hadn't thought of it this way before, because I've been making the religion comparison, but I haven't heard this idea that you were saying some religions look up and some religions look down.
Yeah.
Can you explain what you mean by that?
Yeah. So first, I do want to mention what you just said was extremely clear and to the point. You really did grasp something where this is what will happen in any organization that takes in. We were just talking at the very beginning about how, organizations can't safely take this stuff on. And that's what it does, is it creates enough people who have kind of imbibed some of it to where when eventually a precipitating event occurs, bam, that's the demand to polarize around that event, and everything has to center on that discussion. So eventually such a thing will come, or it can be easily manufactured in a workplace just by one person deciding to scream racism, even if it's made up. So that's always going to happen. And the tearing apart of our society writ large was supposed to be the thing we were trying to warn people could come. And now it's like we have to use the big picture to say, no, even in your little picture, this will always happen. So this is why it can't be let in.
Yeah.
As for faiths, I do think that there of course is a difference. I have a great deal of room for people to have religious beliefs, and I have very little patience for religious beliefs that make them worse, and very much respect for religious beliefs that make them better as people, that lead them to live a more moral life, a more satisfied life, a more knit community life. And that's, we're a secular country. So what that means is I believe that it's a matter of your private conscience and the community that you decide to voluntarily embed yourself within. So I have a lot of respect for religions that help people live better lives. Whereas, of course, just to be upfront, because people have known me in the past, a very upset, angry atheist phase, that was not always true of me. But this is where I am now with that. My thinking is that there are different ways that religions can go sideways and lead people to living a less good life. And I think that wokeness, as a matter of fact, is a religion. And in fact, I think it's what I would call an upside down religion, or a downward pointing religion. Which, take whatever religious metaphors you want from a downward pointing religion. But the upward facing religions in general are ones that focus on, let's say, just to kind of stick close to the Christian context. They focus up on God. They're looking up to God. They're trying to live up to that example. They look at the story, if it's a Christian context specifically, of Jesus, and they try to live up, what would Jesus do? They try to live up to the example of God made man. And then downward facing religions are constantly looking at the presence of sin and evil and the fallen nature of man and obsessing about that. So all faiths really would have the ability to see both of these things. It's not like I'm saying, oh, religions that are completely blithe and just looking up at all the rainbows, those are the good ones. It's not like that. That's where is the primary amount of your focus? Are you focused on God and whatever that means, and is the icon of perfect goodness and that from which all blessings flow, and then aware of the temptations and threats of sin, or are you focused on sin and vaguely aware that there's some God in this case, which would be justice or a utopia? So it's, if we the idea of building a kingdom of heaven within, say, yourself, or within your church community, or I guess if you want to extend it to the society, but stuff starts getting utopian fast when people start doing that. So you want to be careful. But you really would want to be looking up to the example of God and trying to replicate that in your own life, versus we'll get there when we purge the world of the evils. And so those upward facing religions are saying, how do we live up to these principles in our faith? Downward facing religions are, how do we purge our society of deviation from those principles as we see it? And those are two different things. And my contention is that downward facing religions basically go sideways as a rule. Upward facing religions go sideways sometimes, but not terribly often. So there's a huge dichotomy there.
Yeah, I mean, another way to think, what I'm hearing, I'm an atheist, but what I'm hearing when you're saying this is that there's the religious perspective, which is internally focused, which is the point of my beliefs is to better myself. And then there's the religious perspective, which is externally focused, which is the point of my beliefs is to force other people to better themselves by my definitions.
Yeah, that's really funny, actually, because where I came up with the I originally actually first hit upon this with the upside down religion idea. And then not that long ago, I'm also an atheist, by the way, but I also study a Taoist martial art. So I'm quite familiar with the principles of Taoism. And as a philosophy, I don't like the religious stuff they did with it. That's not what this is about. But as a philosophy, it's very interesting. What they talk about in almost all contexts are the 8 directions: up, down, left, right, front, back, inside, outside. And so you can look at it in terms of any of these dichotomies and try to figure out kind of where you could apply it to religions, because Taoism is one of those magic, fun, interpretive things that can apply to everything. So because it's vague and it's a nice just model for thinking about things and not to be taken overly seriously. So I've described it in terms of up and down, or top and bottom, but you could also describe it in terms of inside, outside, the way that you did very well. You could describe it in terms of right and left, where we think of left as kind of this more expansive society, and right in terms of a conservation of what we have that works. So your liberal versus conservative axis. And you could think of front and back as trying to move forward toward progress, and backwards being regressive. So, I mean, that's really a huge aside from anything. But we could play with this and start to see that this woke religion is basically not living up to its promises. It sells itself like it's trying to get to a perfect utopia, that it's the right side of history, that it's upward looking, but it's actually downward looking. It's just obsessed with the sins of systemic racism and systemic power in society and wanting to get rid of them. It claims that it's forward moving, but it's actually backwards moving, because it takes us away from what generates progress and back toward the primacy of lived experience and local feudal tribes. So it heads us back toward medievalism out of modernity. And so we could play with these things. Your inside outside characterization is exactly right. And of course, I would make the argument that despite the fact that this woke position claims that it is of the left, I would actually say it's an incredibly conservative. Helen and I've been trying to find time to write this essay for like 6 months, that the critical social justice ideology is inherently not just conservative, but deeply conservative. And I don't just mean in the kind of the ways that Michel Foucault got accused by the Marxists of being a conservative, or the way that the far left-wing Marxists conserve the social justice movement as being bourgeois and thus conservative. I mean that it is genuinely conservative, in that it is trying to conserve the social categories that used to define society, that we have actually proudly stepped out of. And it says, no, we're going to re-elevate racial categories as being highly important. We're going to really look into the idea that sexuality is something that's just performed rather than how somebody happens to be. We're going to resurrect the idea of the East and the West and say that the West is the awful oppressor, whereas it used to be that the West is the noble oppressor that was coming to free people from barbarism. So it's like they're literally conserving the worst narratives of history that they hate. That's like, I just did another podcast earlier today where I said that it's like critical race theory in a very real way feels like they've got racism on the operating table and they're like doing CPR so they can keep pointing at racism. See, racism's still alive. And they're like trying to pump the blood. They're like, somebody breathe, got the bag going and they're squeezing the bag. It's like they're trying so hard to put social significance back into race in a society that doesn't and hasn't wanted that in a long time. And so that guilt that they're tripping people with is, hey, you haven't really thought enough about race because that was the right thing to do. And so now you need to reckon with the fact that you haven't thought enough about it. And so they're catching people in that moment of like, what if I haven't? Oh my gosh, you're right. I haven't considered race that much. So this is another series of emails, and I'll shut up for a second, that I get is people saying, and I've been really hesitant to say this because it's actually consistent with theory. So it makes theory look right unless you're very careful to pull it apart. And I've thought more about race in the past, or sex or sexuality or gender or whatever it is. I've thought more about identity and race in particular in the past 5 weeks than I have in my entire life. And frankly, I'm sick of it. And of course, what they're saying is, I'm not racist. I haven't thought race was important to focus on, and I haven't treated people that way ever in my life, or not since I was a child, or whatever the circumstances are, depending on the person. And now I'm being forced to, and I don't want that. And I've never wanted that. And I want to go back to not having to force race into everything. And so that we can actually just get along as individuals and see each other eye to eye, and, this not be some eggshell, landmine universe that we have to walk around in, around issues of identity. But what theory, of course, would say, it would say, aha, you haven't been thinking. Your colorblind ideology gave you the, but here's the trick. These are Black people, some of them, telling me this. So their lie is Black people have to think about race every day. Well, no, not all Black people, it turns out. And some of them are awfully sick of having to put race into, say, physics or math all of a sudden, which it's like, I just wanted to be a physicist and now I don't think I can be. I just wanted to be a performance artist and now I don't think I can be, because everything has to be about race. I have to be the brown guy, or I have to be the Black guy if I want to do my art. And it's like, this sucks. It's not, it is some white people, but it's not just white people. It's like, actually, most of us weren't obsessed about race, and it was a good thing. And most of us had, not perfectly, but mostly had moved on. And again, we got these people like pumping racism's heart, trying to keep the Frankenstein's racism monster alive so that they can keep hustling. Look what
this ideology. To that point, we've seen and talked about on this program, these lists they come up with periodically, like on BuzzFeed or other media outlets, and say, 25 racist phrases and words that you didn't know were racist. And they are taking words that may or may not have had racist etymology, but they're trying to find it, and then they're reinfusing these things. It's like cakewalk was on one of these lists, or long time no see. It's like, if I don't know that cakewalk had a racist past, why are you now telling me this is racist? Like, you're pumping, like you said, it's the CPR. They're pumping racism back into our everyday language, like trying to revive it everywhere.
Right. And even in some of those cases where there was a racial component to the either the word or the term or the situation, long time no see actually turns out to be a direct translation from Mandarin of a phrase that means exactly that. I don't remember the phrase in Mandarin. I did. My Mandarin has been slipping. Maybe I should start practicing that again, given the context. But I did know the phrase, something Bujian, but I forgot the first part, the long time part. So anyway, long time no see is a direct translation from Chinese. So was that racist that people started saying it? Was it just a cultural thing because you had the mixing of Chinese immigrants and the American context, and people started saying it? It doesn't know. Who knows? But the point is, even if it was like full on racist, right, 150 years ago, that doesn't mean anybody, like, if you need an article on BuzzFeed to tell you that it's racist and you didn't know it, it wasn't racist. If nobody knew it was racist, it wasn't racist. That's right. How racist works. And it's like, you can't control language the other way, right? So you could say, oh, we're never going to say any of these slurs anymore. And so what do? Oh, they're Karens. You just make up a new slur. So you imbue the meaning into a new word. You can't get away from stuff like that. So if nobody knows a word is racist, if nobody thinks that the OK sign is white power until some jerk on 4chan makes a joke about it, then it wasn't racist. And then the second that social significance got injected into it, oh, now it's racist. And now we had all panic about it. The context of a slur matters. And if nobody thinks the thing is racist, if you need to be informed that it was racist and nobody knew it, it's not racist. And on the other hand, if you think something's not able to be weaponized and as like a big term of bigotry, you have never paid attention to teenagers who can turn anything into an insult. Anything into an insult.
Can we talk about, not to play devil's advocate too much, but I want to tease something out, because I think this is something that maybe hooks people into believing these anti-racism tenets. They will say that color blindness is impossible, right? You can't possibly be colorblind. And which I guess if you have working vision is technically true. You can't be colorblind, right? And so
many puns. I hate the puns, right. But that's what it is. Carry on.
No. So I guess if you look at actually evolutionary biology, right? There is actually
colorblind. All right.
No.
Let's go.
We do have evolutionarily, like, we do have in-group preferences that have developed, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's,
Yep.
I think it is dishonest to pretend that it's impossible that in-group preferences could possibly exist.
Right.
But what we did in the past, which I think was the correct course of action, was to say, regardless of what in-group preferences I may feel from time to time or may come up, I will endeavor to treat people equally and fairly and without regard for whether they're in my group, in any kind of group, whether it's race or gender or whatever it is, religion. I will endeavor to treat them equally regardless of any intrinsic feelings I may have about it that could come from who knows where. But I think what they do instead is they say, well, because color blindness is impossible, and because you may actually have sometimes this inability to be perfectly colorblind, therefore you are actually racist. So your sin is something that's actually not in your control, rather than something where it used to be that your sin was in your control. Your actions determined your sin. Now there's something intrinsic about you that is sinful. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah. So check this out. It's a pun. You have people who are falling for that, Carter, are falling for a pun. There are two meanings of colorblind, and they know it. What you just described in the longer tail end, the reasonable thing, is what colorblind really means. It means we're not going to put prejudicial social significance into race. So if somebody come in for a job, or if I meet somebody as a potential friend or client or whatever in my day-to-day life, I'm not going to prejudicially judge them. I'm not going to put social significance into the race. It doesn't mean that you're not going to see the race in front of you. This is actually a manipulation of language. They are literally lying by using two meanings of the word colorblind to get people hooked in. Now, let me not be so unfair. I can't accuse people of mendacity. I don't know if they're lying. I shouldn't have said that. They might be stupid. They might not know the difference.
No, I think it's an intentional equivocation. I'm not going to be as generous as you are. It's an intentional equivocation.
Well, some people who fall for it, though, are dumb.
Are dumb.
Fair.
And so they don't know that there's two definitions. Okay, so colorblindness means we're not going to put social significance into the racial categories. We're not going to make decisions based upon that. Doesn't mean not seeing race. It doesn't mean not being able to see racism, which is called racism blindness. One of the reasons they attack color blindness is they say it leads to racism blindness. It leads to your average, like, kind of, joke, kind of, you picture your just average, like, I'm picturing the guy with like this rainbow colored triangle shaped hat with the bill off to the side, like just your, stereotypical 90s doofus Billy Madison or something. And it's like, that guy's like, what do you mean racism? Ha ha ha. I don't see color. Ha ha ha. There's no racism anymore. We don't see color. Ha ha. And it's like, come on. Because possibly some people are a little thick, or because some people don't take the time to reflect, doesn't mean that none of us do. And it doesn't, like, there's such a lie there. It is such a manipulation to get people to think it's the same little, like, game, like everything you've ever thought about yourself is wrong. You thought you could not see race, but you actually do. And so, I mean, now there are a number of directions we could talk about. Like, who comes up with a theory like this? I'll tell you who comes up with a theory like this. Because a lot of them, I mean, we can break down and say black people who were subjected to having to deal with this, and people saying stuff like Billy Madison there that wasn't good. And okay, fine, that I can hear you about that. We can talk about it. Maybe there needs to be more listening. But there's also an awful lot of white people coming up with this, like Robin DiAngelo, and a lot of other white people, Allison Bailey, Barbara Applebaum. We can just start going down the list. Richard Delgado, Gene Stefanczyk, so many of these critical race theorists are white people. And they're writing this stuff down, and what's up in their psychology? Well, they're people who see race and think they shouldn't see race, and they're flipping out about it. And so it's like, what do they do? They're like, oh, colorblindness is a lie. I see race all the time. I'm like, okay, well, it means putting social significance in a race. And if that's what you're doing, you're a racist. And if you're not, then chill out, because it's normal to be able to actually detect the skin color somebody has with your eyes. You can even just see in black and white, and you can still see the difference for the majority of people. It's not what it's being sold as. It's really, really insidious. So you are correct. That is a place where they're hooking people. And it's a lot of these little rhetorical strategies where they play double meanings of words. Did you know that colorblindness, that means not seeing race? No, it means not making race significant to making decisions. In fact, you have misappropriated the term in order to do political activism. And I know you did it on purpose at some level. At the scholars level, I can say it's a lie because they've written it down that they know the difference. Yes. They know the difference. Yeah. Those people are lying. Your average person who's picked it up is just like, whoa, dude, I never thought about that before. I had my mind blown, and then they're saying this crazy stuff about colorblindness. But like I said, the issue that they're afraid of getting washed away of having a rise is racism blindness, which would wash away being able to talk about racism in a real way where it still exists and where it's still a problem. As though, there's this assumption that magically, once people stopped putting social significance into race, all race-related problems would go away. Or as if when we say we don't put social significance into race, that it's possible that we includes literally everybody, as opposed to, there being 8 to 10% of the population who's slow and 2 to 3% of the population who's actually just, jerks. It is a manipulative thing. And now we focused on colorblindness, and there are like 50 other identical manipulations that we could focus on where they're doing a double meaning. I mean, even in math, this is a thing that I've been railing on Twitter all week. They're saying,
Can I jump in here? I saw you in a Twitter exchange about math, and I really appreciated this because I like when they're honest. And I think with this acceleration that's happened, this accelerating event, and now it becoming so dominant culturally, this belief system, they're starting to be a bit more honest about things. And one of those things is, for a while, if you've pointed out to them that, you're trying to get me to believe that 2 + 2 isn't 4, I would hear pushback on that. And now they're openly saying 2 + 2 is anything but 4.
That's right. And it's really funny. It's funny, too, because there's a plausible argument that this is my fault. Because I started making those woke minis to make fun of woke people. And somebody was asking me in my DMs one day, it's like, would they really say that 2 + 2 = 5? And I was like, no, the truth is it's 2 + 2 doesn't matter. It's as long as it's not 4, because 4 is the hegemonic value that's oppressing everybody that came from white Western ways of thinking. So it has to be anything else, but it doesn't matter what the other answers are. And so then I made this woke mini. I'm making these little satirical cards, woke minis, and putting them up on Twitter all the time now. And I put one that was 2 + 2 = I don't remember exactly how I phrased it, but it's to the same point that it's 2 + 2 = 4 has its own definition is how I phrase it. So at 2 + 2 = 4, I was like assigning hegemonic white Western value to an equation that excludes all other possibilities. And then the woman that did the 1619 project, Hannah Nicole Jones, quote tweeted it, made fun of it. And the next thing you know, so it could be a coincidence, but the next thing you know, all of these arguments that 2 + 2 doesn't really equal 4, it has to equal anything else, started coming up. So I might actually have been I might have caused that to have erupted. And then, I mean, this happened again today. Somebody sent me a thing where my own entry for science, where I'm trashing the way the wokes think about science in my encyclopedia on new discourses, they quoted my definition of science from the woke perspective as though that's the correct understanding of science. Like they didn't, They thought that that's real. So it's like they can't tell the difference or they don't care. But then this evolved and some woman actually ends up tweeting in the wake of Nicole Hannah Jones doing that, maybe, or maybe it's independent, but I don't think so. This explanation was like, well, I just won't accept that 2 + 2 = 4. It has to be any other value, something like this, because of the power dynamics that have defined it that way.
She's a mathematician, right?
Well, none of them are mathematicians. They're all math teachers. None of them are mathematicians. And so then there's this whole raft of people, and they're making cartoons. They're literally drawing cartoons, like trying to say why 2 + 2 = 4 isn't the right answer because it's limiting of other possibilities. And what they're doing is a word game. And I know we didn't come on here to talk about math, but we'll go into 2 of them on the cartoon. So they're like, well, if you switch to base 3, you have 2 + 2 = 1, 1.
Oh my God!
So that's not
you're
not
fucking
yeah,
kidding
exactly.
me. I'm sorry. You're fucking
not
kidding me.
You want me to send it to you? It's real. I saved that shit, man. I downloaded that picture. God. Bam, that's mine. Keeping that. And so, but the thing is that 1, 1 in base 3 means 3 plus 1, which is the same value as 4. That's what that symbol means. But they're actually saying no, because the symbol is different. You're using 1, 1 instead of 4, that it's a different value. That's one of the arguments that they made. So 2 plus 2 doesn't really equal 4. Sometimes it equals 11 in base 3.
You could make that argument with Roman numerals. Like, I don't understand.
People did.
2 plus 2 equals IV. Like, what the? Sorry, 1 plus 1 equals IV. Like, what? I mean, yeah.
Yeah. I plus II equals IV. Therefore, it's associated with drug use, and we're making a racist statement about how black people use more drugs. I mean, that's the kind
that
of,
was
like,
awesome.
free association.
That was good of you.
It's a free. Oh, it's a free association game. So you just make this bullshit up as you go, and it sticks. So the other one they gave, and this one's a little harder, is that they went to modular arithmetic with residue classes. So I don't know if you know what these are, but they're obviously.
I do, but I think you should explain them to the audience, because I don't think people know what modular arithmetic is.
So there was a pun, just like 2 meanings of colorblind. The pun was on 2 different ways to write down 4. The symbol that we usually associate with 4, the 4th key over on our number bar on our keyboard, that's one way to write 4. And then to write it as the symbol 1, 1, meaning 1, 3 plus 1, 1, as in base 3 is another. You could add a third one, which would be 1, 0, 0 in binary, base 2. We could cook up all kinds of crazy stuff of different ways to write it, but it's the same value. So in modular arithmetic, the pun is not on the symbol. There, modular arithmetic, we could talk about it in terms of residue classes or remainders or blah, 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 like we would do if we were doing a abstract algebra class or getting into group theory. But it's easier to understand it as in terms of clock arithmetic. So imagine that your number, like imagine you have like a gauge, like your water meter or your clock, and the values that it has are 0, 1, 2, 3. 0, 1, 2, 3, and it goes around and around just like on a clock. So on a clock, it's to 12. So let's say it's like 10 a.m. and I say, let's wait 4 hours. What time is it? And you're like 10, 11, 12, 1, 2. So it's 2. And so you have to like go around and start counting over again, right? Well, here, if you had, say, the value 2 on something that's like, I should have done it with base 3, or with modulo class 3, not with 4. So we have with the numbers 0, 1, 2, 0, 1, 2, 0, 1, 2. So if we're at 2, we go around to 2, and then we add 2 more. What happens? We go to 0 and we go to 1. And so the value of 2 plus 2 in that clock arithmetic comes back to 1. You can tell I used to actually teach this in math classes. Right. And so you can kind of understand. It's easier when you can draw it on the board rather than like doing your fingers in the air. But they're saying, well, in modulo 3, which is how you would phrase that in the residue class modulo 3, 2 plus 2 equals 1. And the pun there is on plus. The plus sign means something different because it means clock plus on a clock that only has the values 0, 1, and 2. It doesn't mean plus like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, all the natural numbers. It's a different operation.
Well, modulo operations by definition have overloaded numbers because they have an end and they recirculate, right? That's what you do when you have modulo math.
So this is, again, a pun. It is a pun. It is a word game. And they're like, aha, so 2 plus 2 does not always equal 4. And what they're depending on, just like we were saying a minute ago, they're either dumb or lying, and they're depending on people who don't know and are therefore ignorant to fall into the trap. That, oh, wow, mathematicians don't know everything. Wow, even the experts didn't know this. And it's like there's not a mathematician alive who doesn't realize what's going on here and isn't already halfway through a bottle of Jack Daniels for having encountered it. Like your response, you were like, oh, God, like the second I said it.
I was a cryptographer for like 10 years, so I did all modulo math. Like that's all cryptography, basically. So,
right,
yeah,
ciphers and shit.
Yeah.
So,
but they don't care.
Yeah.
They don't use words, James, right? They're not using words to correspond to actual meanings in reality. They're using words as manipulation tools to affect a political end, and that's the fundamental thing that I think a lot of people don't understand about this.
Right, and let me take you one step further back from that. They're using words in a way to create a fog of confusion into which they can assert the political end. So now they've got a double meaning on colorblind, they've got a double meaning on anti-racism, they've got a double meaning on 4, and then they're like, aha, see, white Western math just says that 2 + 2 = 4, and it excludes all other values. But here's a way that it can equal 100, and here's a way it can equal 11, and here's a way that it can equal 1. So all the other values are actually possible, and they just didn't want you to know that. And people who don't know are like, what? What's going on? What's going on? And like, so what we need to do is introduce ethnomath that teaches this kind of thing in a more comprehensive way that you never learned. And I'm like, oh, crap. And then they're like, wow, maybe I didn't learn math correctly. Yeah, you're right. We need to have a better math class where we're not getting, we don't miss this kind of stuff. And that's what they're doing. That's the trick.
Well, now that would be fine with me if they would just, if they want to separate and have a society whereby they operate under the assumption that 2 + 2 is anything, and we build bridges under the assumption of 2 + 2 is 4. That's fine. But they want to impose it on the rest of us. I think is the issue.
The thing that they're angry about, which is ultimately that the Western civilization arose in Europe, gained massive military power, and then used that to tremendous abuses to conquer the world first, mostly physically with colonialism, and then in imperialism, and then later conceptually and ideologically because their stuff worked. That's exactly like what would happen if we were to separate. And it's like, you said, oh, they're going to drive on 2 + 2 = whatever bridges, and we're going to drive on 2 + 2 = 4 bridges. No. They're going to create 2 + 2 = whatever you want, bows and arrows, and we're going to create 2 + 2 = 4 nuclear weapons. And again, they're just going to, it's a march back to medievalism. But I say this in terms of weapons, right? And you're like, oh, I don't know if that's an uncomfortable argument, James. But then you change that into like our food supply chain. Do you think that thing just works by itself? Look how close it came to collapsing under COVID when our meatpacking plants got hit with viruses so quickly that it looked like we might possibly lose a year's worth of food or 2 years worth of food stock because the supply chain collapsed. So when you have 2 + 2 = whatever, what did the white men say? Not that. When you have that, which of course is offensive, by the way, because people who were not white, long before white people had any power in the world at all, figured out that 2 + 2 = 4 and wrote it down in various ways and had very sophisticated mathematics. But if you're going to have that, you're going to have a society that starts collapsing. We can talk about it in terms of weapons, or we can talk about it in terms of functional systems that keep an advanced democracy around and working. It's like the internet and the fish sticks at the grocery store don't just keep happening if you break all of the systems that actually make those things come into existence. And no, it's not going to be better when you suddenly have 300 and some odd million people, or worldwide 7 some odd billion people who don't have functioning food distribution networks anymore. That's when our real when problems unprecedented in human history start.
So you're reminding me of something that this is something that actually way back to even the Frankfurt School people who did actually believe in an objective reality, unlike the postmodernists, right? If you read like Marcuse, for example, you've got this confusion between the metaphysical and the man-made, which I think is part of the inherent problem with neo-Marxism, right? There's like, goods are here. How did they get here? They're here and they need to be distributed. Like, just like air is here, factories are here, and factories should be distributed like air without any understanding of like where factories come from. And the reason I brought up Marcuse is because I specifically want to ask you, I know that you've been talking a lot about the postmodernism roots of this in this show anyway. But if I read like, what's the one, the repressive tolerance or whatever, like if you read right? If you read that, it almost reads like an instruction manual for what the social justice warriors are going to do today. It doesn't have the postmodern arguments that are used to obfuscate. Right. He still believes in an objective reality, but he basically is saying like, oh, violence is like the argument is basically that he commits presidio what is it, presidio patipi, whatever assuming the argument, right? Presidio. I can't pronounce it, right? But he admits it blatantly. Marxism is the answer. Therefore, here's all the things we need to justify to get to Marxism, and that includes using violence possibly, and not being tolerant towards opinions of people that basically aren't neo-Marxists. And to me, it just reads like a manual, but I think a lot of people... I don't think people understand where postmodernism and neo-Marxism get married into social justice, if that's even how you would describe it. Like, how does this modern philosophy
mated, married. I got your back on all this. This is the thing we figured out writing Cynical Theories. So first, I will point out with repressive tolerance, if you don't know the date on that, it was 1965, which is relevant because you said it's like an instruction manual for what's going on now. Well, it was an instruction manual for what happened in 1967 and 1968 also, with all of the violence and the riots that were, rather isomorphic to what's going on now.
Can I ask a really quick question there? Since it was 1965, do you think, was Marcuse looking at the failure of Marx's predictions to have the proletariat revolt and trying to come up with some reason why that didn't happen and how we need to make it happen? Was that the motivation? Do you know?
The motivation for repressive tolerance, to the best of my understanding, was that he had decided that in a world in which fascism has arisen, we are constantly at the brink of fascist takeovers. And so he believed in some level that the reason that the communist revolutions didn't happen was partly that liberal culture stole it away by creating like social safety nets and so on, and by distracting people with enjoyable things like television and entertainment and consumer products. And then simultaneously that the fascists came in and filled that vacuum and basically asserted themselves. So he started to believe that everything that wasn't Marxism was a gateway to fascism. And
that sounds similar.
That was what needed.
Familiar.
That's what needed to, doesn't it? That's what needed to be suppressed, including by violence. So he even near the end of the essay writes that violence is always unethical, which he literally then follows up in the next sentence with, "But when have ethics ever been relevant to making history?" And then he goes on in the next paragraph to describe that violence that's in service to the revolution is justified, and violence that is reactionary against the revolution is not justified. And I mean, this thing, it looks like an instruction manual because it is. And the last time it got put into practice was when the Black Power movement and the other radical movements, the Weather Underground and so on, decided to go violent in the late 1960s until society finally decided they were sick of tired of the violence and got rid of it. And it drove them underground into the universities, where they eventually took up postmodern theory. And we can tell that part of the story and answer your question. So what happened,
which seems, by the way, was part of his plan also. He explicitly says in there, hey, we need to take over the institutions because the establishment will never do this. Yeah. Okay.
That's right. Because he had read Antonio Gramsci, where Gramsci had not yet been translated into English. So he got to look like he really knew what he was talking about, but he was really lifting the ideas of somebody from, 45 years earlier who was a proper, lunatic in his own right. And so, yes, that is correct. And he was at his nice, comfortable post at Columbia University creating radicals. And well, let's just tell the story with names. So he's radicalizing a woman named Angela Davis, who ends up, arrested for acts of terrorism and violence. And she's like a proper lunatic. And she goes on to inspire a generation of Black feminists and Black liberation thinkers. She was very neo-Marxist. She considered Marcuse to be one of the inspirations that allowed her to understand how to be simultaneously an activist and a scholar, to combine those things, and in fact a revolutionary. She has a very famous statement about how Marcuse led her to that. So who has Angela Davis inspired? Well, Derek Bell, who went on to start creating critical race theory at Harvard Law, Kimberly Crenshaw, who also took it up. I would assume, but I don't know, I haven't looked into it deeply enough to figure out if Bell Hooks was significantly influenced by Angela Davis. I would imagine she would have had to have been. And Bell Hooks was very interested also in, the Black feminist movement that was rising up out of this milieu of the kind of more intellectualized New Left, as it was called. Marcuse's movement was called the New Left. And Bell Hooks also started to flirt with postmodernism, as did some of the other Black feminist thinkers at the time. And what happened is in 1991, whereas all of this was starting to get laid out, 1990 and 1991, actually 1989, are very significant years for the question you're asking: how did postmodernism come in to this story? And so you had a bunch of people kind of flirting with the theory, poking at the theory, and seeing the utility of deconstruction of that which is hegemonic and powerful. But they realized the danger was that it would be able to deconstruct race. It would be able to deconstruct their own power if they were able to get it. And so they needed a way to deal with that. And the answer really came out of Kimberly Crenshaw and Patricia Hill Collins. Patricia Hill Collins wrote a book called Black Feminist Thought in 1990 that is more or less a rewrite of Michel Foucault and his ideas about power, but applying them to race. And kind of burying the relevance of Foucault so that it's harder to find, and saying that this is actually Black feminist thought, not postmodern thought. And Kimberly Crenshaw wrote a paper in 1991. She introduced in 1989 the idea of intersectionality. In 1991, she wrote the paper that established intersectionality as she described it at the end of the paper, a provisional link between contemporary politics and postmodern theory. So that paper starts off by saying that Black feminism lives in the margins. It's called Mapping the Margins of Radical Feminism and Black Liberationism. Those are both neo-Marxist. I mean, radical feminism is a little more complicated. It had its own history, but it took up a ton of the Marxism and neo-Marxism through the 50s and 60s and 70s, and was, very invested in Marxist type or Marxian type analyses already. And she said that radical feminism is basically white feminism. It ignored Black women. And Black liberationism was mostly about Black nationalism and mostly a male movement, and that it ignored Black women. So Black feminism becomes this thing in the margins that has to be elevated, and intersectionality is a tool to elevate it. The next section of the paper is a long critique of liberalism, saying how liberalism has prevented this from being able to be the case. She takes particular aim at the idea of colorblindness and starts arguing that there's a fundamental difference, digging into liberation school, which is neo-Marxism. It's a fundamental difference between the statement, I am Black, and the statement, I am a person who happens to be Black. What's her problem with I am a person who happens to be Black? Well, her problem with that is that it forwards the universal person instead of the Black identity. And so the purpose here now is clear that it's identity politics that have to be done. And then, like I said, she then goes on to say, to give a critique of postmodernism. The critique of postmodernism she gives is that it's an excellent set of tools, but it makes the mistake of thinking you can deconstruct anything, because people who suffer systemic oppression don't have that luxury and can't deconstruct their race or the oppression they experience because of it. So now we're going to take identity like race or queerness. She actually mentions queer in the paper. We're going to take those identities off the table from deconstruction, and we'll deconstruct everything else that is the power systems that create that oppression. So this is where you said marriage. I usually say mutation or mating. This is where these two lines of thought reforged into one. And what happened is you get all of that corrosive universal solvent of critical theory, plus the absolute ability to deflect any claim of objective truth by saying, well, that's just your culture. That's not objective, really. And so now all of a sudden you have this critical social justice movement that's working on social justice issues through identity politics, which are meant to be neo-Marxist, radical liberation politics from the critical theory school, that's now no longer encumbered by having to attach to the truth, because the truth is a white Western way of knowing, and it's just one of many that has excluded others. And you end up with this monster that is borderline unstoppable. You have communism, in a sense, if you will, advancing on the most divisive issues that you can imagine, personal identity where there's some kind of injury and grievance attached to it, and with no obligation to the truth. Absolutely no obligation to the truth. And that is the monster that we are fighting today, that is presently mainlining and taking over things, including our federal government.
So it seems like.
Can I ask you a question, James?
Go ahead.
Can I jump in, Carter?
Yeah, go ahead.
So when you're talking about the things that are taken off the table, and I want to get back to, I'm glad we're jumping into the theory part of it, but I want to get back to practical application for people who are dealing with stuff in a second. But before I go there, one quick question. You're talking about the things that were taken off the table with this marriage or this mutation. Mm-hmm. I've often wondered why we haven't seen an explosion of this idea of transracialism yet, where people can claim, because if biological sex is a social construct, which they are now saying, the same way that race is a social construct, which back when I was learning this stuff 20 years ago in college, I was learning all about race as a social construct. That logically, and again, I know they're not consistent, but if they were, you would think that at some point you would see a large portion of people saying, well, I identify, like Rachel Dolezal, I identify as Black. So, but so far it seemed they seem to have really the SJWs I know have really prevented that from moving forward. And what is the difference there between gender and race?
Yeah,
why is one off limits?
Yeah, they're theorized differently. Now we can talk about why on two different levels, but we'll do the theory one first, and maybe we'll get a little into people's heads second. I like to try to stay out of people's heads, but maybe it's necessary a little now. Okay, so theory. Queer theory positioned the idea, and that's where trans issues come out of, or trans ideology comes out of, is out of queer theory, that it seems very natural that we're stuck into our sexes, male and female, and they position the idea that being stuck into your sex is itself the oppression. And so queer theory said that you affect liberation. So remember, liberation is the solid core here of their ideology. You affect liberation by breaking down the meaning in stable categories. You get rid of the stable categories. Okay, so trans is kind of like the pinnacle of that, because you have people who are literally crossing from one identification to another very willfully, therefore saying that the basis of the categories themselves is something that can be transgressed. So the goal of queer theory is to remove social significance from sexual, gender, and sexuality categories. That's very important. Race, on the other hand, was theorized exactly the opposite. It was to put social significance back into race. And if you look historically, you can see why. What was happening was that all of these liberation movements were using all of the racism to do their radical activism, and racism was just becoming a less and less credible argument. People cared less and less about race, and therefore they had to increase the amount of significance. However, that wasn't what was going on with the LGBT movement. And in fact, I should just say really the L and G movement. I forget what they called the alliance that they had initially. It was just lesbians and gays. And the point of being a lesbian is that you're a woman that's attracted to a woman. And the point of being gay is that you're a man that is attracted to a man. So that requires man and woman to be stable categories in both, and that sexual orientation itself can be stable. So they had to move away from the idea in queer theory that those are stable categories, because that's required in order to break down A, heteronormativity, male attracted to female, and then B, the kind of normalization of gayness that was trying to happen with male and male gay and female lesbian. That normalization is the enemy in queer theory, because that normalization is what upholds heteronormativity, which is that most people are male-female attracted, and that's okay. That people see that as okay. They see that as the problem. So that's the thing that has to be destroyed at all costs. So you have to take all meaning out of those categories. With race, it was very different. People became less and less concerned with what race people were. And so you have to put social significance back into racial categories, and you have to make it so that what gives that social significance is the experience of having been that race. So we can get into the experience side now. So within racial politics, within critical race theory specifically, the idea is that the lived experience of oppression, of being a particular racial category, is what gives you insight into how the world works. In queer theory, it's that the lived experience of not being able to transgress your sexuality or your gender or your sex is what causes the oppression that you have to be liberated from. So you have this opposite directions of theorizing of identities with regard to sex, gender, and sexuality versus race. Now, that's the theory reason. Get in their heads. Massive people were realizing there was massive social cachet in being able to play into their race, and they don't want that exclusive social cash to spread to other people. That's it.
Yes.
The Black people were benefiting very explicitly from affirmative action for a while. Then this diversity, equity, inclusion stuff came in. There were definite advantages being given to Black people. Not only were we looking at the lack of social significance in race, it was no longer a means for somebody to be special and to lean on their identity to get ahead, and you actually have to go forward on your merits, which is hard. So attack meritocracy. Now you have actually advantages. Not to say that there wasn't still racism, and not to say that there weren't still wealth gaps and lots of other problems. You don't have to dismiss any of that to say that the reality of the times was that everybody knew that Black culture was the coolest culture. Everybody knew that. Everybody knows that still. Like, they're just cool people. It's just cool culture. And that's why they have cultural appropriation. They're scared everybody's going to steal their cool stuff and profit off of it where they didn't get to. It's very clear, like, the mentality, what's happening here. And so if you're going to preserve access there, and especially if you're going to launch a all-out rhetorical and social assault on whiteness, you can't allow white people to abandon their whiteness. So, I mean, that's basically the long and short. Theoretically, they say that whiteness is a property that all people that are white happen to get. They can't avoid being complicit in that. Obviously, if you're being given a statement that you're complicit in a sin and you're being manipulated based on that, and there's a lot of power based on that, you can't let people say, nah, I changed my mind, I'm trans, I'm Black now, I've been hanging out in the hood and I'm out of that. It's like, you can't let it happen.
So why with women though? Why? So as a group, women also, I would argue, it became at this time in history you're talking about, it became beneficial to be a woman also with affirmative action. Or you see in the social justice world now, it's like they will look at a panel, for example, at a science conference and say, I'm not going to be at this conference until there's 50% representation on the panel. And so women are getting positions just simply for being a woman. Why is it though that women allowed this I guess, invasion into the category of woman in a way that you didn't see the Black people allow this invasion into the category of Black? What is it about women that makes them more amenable to this?
I don't think it's that they're more amenable to it, to be honest. I think it's that the sex, gender, sexuality triad had already linked them into solidarity across those lines. So the feminist movement was much more invested in the queer theory kind of thing that offshot from it. Judith Butler started off clearly within feminist theory, and then eventually it switched into queer theory as she went further. You see the paper Doing Gender was clearly within feminism as it was slowly morphing into gender studies. In fact, the paper Doing Gender, which is a 1987 paper, is probably indicative of the real shift to gender studies out of just feminism. And so there was already a ton of investment there that prevented feminist women, who were the only women doing any of this anyway, to have any ground to stand on to push back. Because if they were going to, they would say, oh, well, you just don't care about your, lesbian sisters, or you don't care about your bi and trans, these issues. You've got to care about these. You can't be exclusive like this, blah, blah, blah. And of course, what you really had also going on was this kind of rash of very angry lesbian separatist type radical feminists that were at the time in the late 70s going into the 80s, who were massively losing popularity. So they didn't look like the cool hip kids anymore. The gay rights movement's flaring up. So all of a sudden you have the feminists who are going to back up the gay rights movement and the feminists who aren't, where gay rights movement is starting to be this blurry double meaning, where the queer theorists are actually starting to take over the definitions. So they didn't have the ground to stand on, whereas the Black feminism, from the perspective of anybody that's not Black or feminist or woman, is like, woo, can't touch that. How are you going to poke both of those at the same time and criticize that? So the Black feminists who are putting forth this identity first politic coming out of Black power were very much different. And also, I mean, you got to look at what the feminists were doing. The feminists at the time, radical feminists going back to like freaking the second sex, like 1949, the feminists were already trying to break down the category of gender while maintaining the category of sex. So they were already in the investment of breaking down categories. They just didn't have any ground to stand on. Whereas the Black liberation movement was Black power. So it's like dump investment into the racial category. And so they've been already for decades going in divergent directions. And by the time this kind of intersectionality thought started to come into the fore, they just didn't have ground to stand on to do it. So I don't think that we will ever see transracial arguments. Like race will just cease to become a significant category where anybody cares before we will see a transracial argument backed up and accepted by this kind of theory.
Wow. Well, that explains a little bit about because I can't remember the paper, the person who published it, but last year there was the dust up of the academic who published a paper about transracialism and
Yeah, Rebecca Tuvell at Hypatia.
okay. And
Yeah,
it went
it
nowhere.
blew up. Well, it blew up. It went the opposite of nowhere. So this was actually it was before we did our papers. So it was in like 2016 or 17. And it actually was accepted by Hypatia. She argued that she did a philosophical argument that said the arguments for transracialism parallel perfectly the arguments for transgenderism. Therefore, why are we not doing this? Why is this not a thing? And what happened was Hypatia accepted it and published it, and the public outcry went berserk. And it went so bad that Hypatia ended up having all of its editorial board resign. They had to reform their editorial board completely. They were coming after Rebecca Tuvell's PhD. They were coming after, they had the paper, I don't remember if they ended up getting it retracted or if Hypatia tried to stand by it. I don't remember the exact details, but it was a, all out struggle.
I think they retracted it.
I think so too. It was an all-out struggle session against the journal and Rebecca Tuvell for having dared to transgress this idea. I mean, it was a meltdown. And the scary part of that one was I remember reading that Rebecca Tuvell said that there were scholars that she had been friends with like her whole career and long time in her life who were writing to her in private saying, I support you. I hope everything's okay, blah, blah, blah. And then writing public denunciations of her at the same time.
I guess that's the definition of cancel culture lately, right? That's how it works.
That's mental. Yeah. That's absolutely mental. That's happening. I have to make the public statement against you, but privately I support you. Don't worry. Don't tell anybody. You have my support. I can't imagine, by the way, as a human being, how pissed off I'd be at anybody who did that to me. The people who are just trashing me, I'd be kind of mad at, but people who did that duplicitous stuff, oh man. I can't even express how mad I'd be about those people. Like they thought they were being a friend. It's like, oh my gosh.
Yeah.
This stuff's evil, man. This stuff is evil.
So actually, well, can we talk about the maybe not the evil nature of it, although I guess we can, but just as a layperson sees this stuff roll out, there's a patina of credulity to a lot of the stuff that's been spewed. Mm-hmm. Even if they don't understand it, and that comes from the fact that it's quote academic. It comes from the academy in some sense.
That too, yeah. I wasn't thinking that actually when you were saying that, but that is true. That's important.
Yeah. So it comes from the academy, and they don't understand the arguments from the academy, and they don't understand. I mean, frankly, you could spend your entire career trying to detangle someone like Derrida and figure out how this applies to what there's no end to the volumes of gibberish that can be written to support this stuff, but I think a lot of people assume that this is a good faith attempt by the academy to get at real truths about morality and justice and that these ideas just kind of have naturally fallen out of a well-meaning, well-intentioned quest for figuring out what we should do as a society to be moral. And when in fact, as far as I can tell, you've got on the one hand that marriage, it's a marriage between people who had a political ideology called Marxism or neo-Marxism and spent their careers trying to justify it by whatever means necessary, including justifying violence. And then you had postmodernists who were like, we're just going to, we're going to navel gaze for a while. Nothing we're talking about is real. I'm not even sure if objective reality exists. But we built these nuclear weapons. If you guys would like to use them for your cause, go ahead. And there actually isn't an authentic, sincere moral exploration behind any of this. Is that incorrect or is that correct?
I can answer both ways. I can say yes and I can say no, and I can mean it in both cases. Okay. So I think you covered the argument, in fact, that it is not good faith. I think that it misses the fact that basically every scholar that's working in it is painfully sincere in the same way that Christopher Hitchens said that every one of the vast majority of the pastors that he met that were saying, crazy religious stuff were the most painfully sincere people he'd ever met in his life. And so that gives the opposite side. They think what they're doing is good faith. And that transfers. It's funny because, impact versus intent is like one of their things, but
Right.
it transfers to people. They see that they have a good faith. So what people really need to understand is that what this is I tried to do it badly with a tree metaphor earlier, that this is a different way to view the world, and it has a different ethics. And if you're doing good faith and a different ethics, you're doing good faith but with bad ethics. And if it has a different epistemology, as a matter of fact, is a different way of generating knowledge. And so you have to understand those two things. And when you understand that, you can see how people operating in good faith in service to that worldview are actually not operating in good faith in service to the prevailing worldview. So both things are true at once, if you follow me. How typical of this to be that way. And so
yeah. But they're
I'll
not. Are
describe
they
their
honest about
ethics.
their epistemology, by the way? Because it seems like if they just said
It
that
slips,
outright,
man.
people would dismiss it, right?
It slips. I think they genuinely believe it, but it's like I've seen so many conversations where it's like they start to try to, dance around multiple truths and multiple realities, and then, they have to say the next thing, and then they can't quite maintain it because they don't fully grok their own metaphysic. They don't fully believe their own metaphysic, but I think they do. I think they actually are operating a good faith within a system that sucks, and their ethic is that critical theory liberationism, which is kind of by any means necessary, tear apart the oppressions of society so that we can effect liberation from that oppression as we defined it, which basically means not being communist. And so they have this ethic that's constantly to effect liberation from their view of systemic oppression. That's their entire ethical system. Then secondly, they've replaced epistemology, knowledge production. So if it's philosophy, you have defeasibility, right? I'm going to forward the best ideas I can using epistemic adequacy. I'm going to use sound and valid arguments. I'm going to try to follow existing theories of thought or patterns of thought or known philosophical arguments and extend them or modify them or correct for them or whatever it is. And then you add in the concept of defeasibility, where you're going to then cut down ideas that are incorrect by showing where there are contradictions, where there are weaknesses in the argument. Maybe the argument wasn't actually valid, or its premises weren't actually sound, and stuff was overlooked. So this is defeasibility. How might this belief be false? And then you explore whether or not that's the case. And so this is how philosophy proceeds to generate something that is or is like knowledge. And then in science, it's harder than that, because we proceed from theories, which are very robust, built up objects, to forward new ideas, and we cut those ideas down with falsification, which is do the experiment. As Feynman said, it doesn't matter how beautiful your theory, if it disagrees with the experiment, it's wrong.
Right.
And that's falsification. And so that's a standard. In this case, they've changed everything. Their epistemology is that they forward ideas from the lived experience of oppression, and they cut bad ideas down by seeing where there are problematics, where it hurts somebody's feelings, where it could cause the maintenance of systems of oppression, and so on. So they're operating in good faith in a system that doesn't even think the same way. This is why, it's perfect for your show that you call it Deprogrammed, because people are like, well, isn't this like a cult indoctrination? And I keep telling people, no, this is not indoctrination, it's reprogramming. It's literally changing the way people think ethically and epistemologically about the world. It is a completely different view of the world, which is not the same as an indoctrination.
But I've heard Helen say this before, which I really like. She made the point that a lot of this is really a luxury afforded to them through a society built on the opposite premises of the ones they're putting forward.
That's correct. That is correct.
Well,
but
it's
they don't.
your two trees analogy.
Right. They don't understand how the society works, right? They have no idea. So when we say the two trees, if we take to that metaphor where I said that the one is a parasite off the other, it's not rooted in the ground, it's rooted in the side of the trunk. But they don't know that. They're just floating around in the canopy. They don't have the slightest idea how a food supply chain works, and they don't care. The food's at the grocery store. Duh. They have no idea how anything works, and they don't care to look. They don't look at the roots. They don't look at the bottom of the trunk. They're floating around in the leaves, playing in the fruit, dancing around. And the tree is actually a parasite growing out of the side, not out of the ground. It is growing out of the side of the tree, the liberal modern tree. And so it is. This is a set of luxury beliefs that can only be supported by a successful and strong system that can produce excess wealth to fund these people from doing this, because subsistence farmers aren't doing critical theory. They don't have time. They're a bit busy, not dying by digging up rocks and trying to plant corn. So this is a set of luxury beliefs that, and I don't know any other way to put it. We want to get to bad faith, but I don't think it is. I think it's willful ignorance about how things actually work. I think it's utopian thinking.
I mean, it almost sounds like you're saying Marcuse was right in some sense, that like there is this established universe of meaning, there is this dumbing down of people, and this affords them the free time to go off. And he thought the threat was that they would go off and support capitalism, but instead it actually enables them to go off and ponder critical theory. I don't know.
I mean, to some degree, and that's when we were saying before, that you said there's a veneer of respectability because of the academy, and I suddenly said, oh, that's not what I thought you meant. Everything that they're saying has grains of truth in it, every bit of it. There are pieces of all of it that are true, and that's why it works. So when they say something like white fragility, some white people actually do throw a fit when they have to deal with looking at race in an uncomfortable way, and they don't know how to do it. It's not totally made up. It's not pulled out of a hat. If it's pulled out of a hat, it'd be harder to believe. There are people who are genuinely put to conflict because of feeling like they're forced by society to constrain themselves into a sex or gender role. So the queer theory thing has that kernel of truth at the bottom, and they can always point to that and say, well, what about the person who blah, blah, blah? And, they give the sad story about, well, somebody grew up, she's a tomboy, and she never felt like she was really a girl, and now she was made to be a girl and wear dresses, and she was miserable, and then she committed suicide, or, something like this. They can always point to those kinds of stories to show that, things aren't perfect, and that there is therefore a kernel of truth, a veneer of truth to it. It's definitely the case that when you have a very wealthy society that can afford, say, performance artists, or that can afford airy-fairy theorists who don't have to do experiments on things like practical, how do you make the planes fly or whatever. They can do just a airy-fairy theory. When you have enough luxury in society to do that, then people can run off and study whatever it is. Again, Marcuse, it turns out, was incorrect about what fancies they would follow, because he underestimated, I think, the power of the thing he was unleashing into the world, which is bitching about everything. And it's very cheap and very easy to bitch about stuff and look cool. To look like you're the smarter person who figured out the loophole in the system, and everything you ever thought was wrong. Look at how I just blew your mind. I found the counterexample. That's a very seductive way to think, especially to people who are not trained and disciplined enough to do careful, rigorous thought. So, I mean, one other element of this then becomes the overproduction of elite cultural professionals. Overproduction of actors, overproduction of performance artists, overproduction of elite academics, and there's just not enough jobs to give these people something to do. And so what you end up with is a large number of underperforming people and a small number of highly successful people who seem to be getting all of the accolades. And a lot of those, it doesn't take all of them. A lot of those underperforming people are very quickly going to become envious and decide that the society is somehow unfairly favoring that jerk. I mean, I've had stories like this in my own past.
It's happened in every, like you talked about, we're now at a place where we're looking, because it has become culturally dominant in the mainstream, we're looking at the big picture and working backwards now to explain how it can rot any small group from the inside out, right? Mm-hmm. But back before we got to this point, when we were talking about the small groups, you could see it happening. I mean, in the feminist door. So I think of social justice ideology as, there's several doors you can use to get in there. I opened the feminist door to go inside, and in the feminist, intersectional feminist, third wave blogging world, 10, 15 years ago, this happened where there were a certain number of feminist bloggers who rose to the top, who had the successful blogs, who were getting jobs in legacy media, mainstream media, who were writing books, and then a lot of envious other bloggers who didn't have a big platform, who started huge mobbing campaigns where we talk about how they always eat themselves, but a lot of times that's because it's like you've had your turn at the top, I'm going to pull you down, and they pull people down in the same way they pull anyone down, which is by going after their identity or their privilege,
right,
and whatever.
Who they slept with or who they hooked up with that gave them a leg up they didn't deserve. Oh, you slept your way to the top. Yeah, totally. This has even happened to me where maybe, I suck at philosophy. That's fine. I don't care. I'm putting forth my ideas. I'm putting them out into the world, and that's what there is. But there's like an entire cottage industry, and I could name names that I won't name, who I know because I've seen screenshots of text messages where they just went berserk. There's this cottage industry. Everything I freaking do shows up on Reddit's r/bad philosophy, saying what a terrible philosopher and how stupid I am. And you can just read the envy. And you're like, oh, Jim, you can't interpret what they're saying. No, I've seen the freaking text messages saying he's stupid. He's a second-rate thinker. I'm a lot better thinker. And my essays aren't getting... Yeah. And it's like, bitch some more. I mean, that's what this is. It's a standard form of envy, but what we're now in is a non-standard way to mobilize complaining using social media and to mob people on social media or to create Reddit threads about how stupid they are and relentlessly try to drag them down and nip at their toes. Whereas before you had to put some real effort into harassing somebody into wanting to kill themselves or quit. Not now. And it's now, in fact, it's weaponized to the point where you can just allege something and everybody's like, oh, no, he's a racist. We got to fire him quick. Get him out. Tearful apology. Then fire him. Oh, your wife said the wrong thing. Fire him. It's like you can see what this is. It is hard to succeed as it is. We have an increasingly bent gig economy where the gig economy is much more like a free market. Free markets create gilded eras. You have to have proper regulation on markets or else you get gilded eras. If the market's too free, it's no longer free because a small proportion of people get all of the credit. Here's a great example. Gig economy, period, though. You have a small number of people, say on Patreon, making loads of money, lots of people scrabbling for some down below, and some proportion of them are just going to get jealous and decide it's not fair that other people are doing better. But in book publishing, the story is that, I don't know what the exact numbers are, but I saw them a number of years ago, that roughly 50% of the royalties for book sales go to the top 20 authors. Not 20%, 20. So there are approximately 2 to 3 million books a year being published, and 20 of them get half of the money. So when you have a wide open democratic situation like in employment, like the gig economy, you have a very few number of big winners and then a very rapid drop off to zero. As a matter of fact, here's another story about this. It's at one point we were discussing, we're trying to figure out what's my speaking fee. And we were all talking about it. It wasn't me personally, but all of us that we were talking about, where's our speaking fee? What kind of a crowd? Well, let's figure out what kind of a crowd we could draw, and we'll figure out our speaking fee from there. And so it was like, well, what kind of a crowd can Jordan Peterson pull? And Jordan Peterson at the time was pulling like, auditoriums, like thousands of 5,000 people would show up to hear Jordan Peterson talk. What kind of a audience could Sam Harris pull? 300 or 400 or 500 people. We go on down the list. What kind of draw do I have? And it's like, we were kind of exaggerating, but the answer is zero. Like if I'm the headliner, it's zero. Zero people are coming to see me as a headliner. Maybe it's 10, but it's like the drop off from 5,000 to there's like literally, we could go right down the list. I said Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris. We could go right down the list and rattle off like all 15 people that can draw an audience that's big enough to make a living doing, say, 1 talk or 2 talks a month, and nobody else. And everybody else is scrabbling for that corner in the market. And again, that envy of some people who decided that it's somehow not fair is always going to be the case. So you saw feminism is eaten up with it. Man, they hate each other.
The knitting world. We've done a number of videos on the social justice incursion into the knitting world, and a lot of it just reads as naked resentment of the yarn dyers and the pattern makers who've created a following. It's funny you mentioned Peterson, because I think I first heard him talking about this, about how in any field, let's take music, for example, you're going to have like 50% of the music that we listen to, or like classical music, for example, done by a small handful of composers. I forget what he called that. Is it
the Pareto principle is what you're talking about?
Pareto principle.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, I mean, we're on
it's
steroids
the square
with
root
that
of the.
too, though.
Yeah, I think technically it's the square root of the number of people produces half the output generally. So in any organization, something like that.
So we're on steroids with that because what the internet has done is turned every market like global or at least, national. The journalism market's national. Every market's national now. There's no such thing as a local story. Nothing. There's no interest in that. There's only that which hits the big time on a national stage, and everything possibly could. And so, just statistically speaking, like imagine, so like Instagram influencers, right? There's Envy City right there. So Instagram influencers, you have people that are getting paid $7,000 to put on a pair of pants and put a picture on Instagram wearing the pants, like for real. And these people are, raking in money hand over fist faster than they know what to do with it, and that's fine. But the problem is obviously that doesn't extend to most people because most people can't become influencers because there is some kind of a distribution, which might be normal, it might be Pareto, it might be whatever shape that defines talent in that particular regard of whatever's selling there. And with Instagram influencers, it's going to have to be like crazy photography skills or crazy attractive or crazy athletic or some combination of all of those. And those are the only people who are, we're talking tail end. So 30 years ago, you mostly had to compete against a local market. So if you were going to be the singer of your town, you only had to be better than, whatever number of singers would show up, 40 singers or whatever. You only had to compete against 40 people, and everybody knew you had to go somewhere like LA, and that's where it got really hard, and that's where all the talent went. And, you have all those stories like, oh, you're at the big leagues now, and you can't compete. But now everybody's comparing themselves to the top person in the world in their field. And that's who they're actually competing against. And so the amount of ability for that to generate a feeling that it's hopeless and a feeling that with Jordan Peterson particularly, he was saying some things that really upset a lot of people and that maybe were even off color in various ways, but he always seemed to back them up within his own views, at least. And there were a lot of people whose views were, God, I could do the same thing he's doing so much better than he could. Why does he get so much attention? And that's just a breeding ground for envy. But when you're comparing yourself against a literally global or at least national or multinational market, and you're looking at tail end behavior statistically, there are only going to be a few people who are at the top of anything. And then it's only a small proportion. I mean, what is it? Sturgeon's law is 10% or 90% of everything is crap. I mean, it just says that, you have to get to like 1.8 standard deviations above the mean to be good. The definition of good is 1.8 standard deviations above the mean, or whatever the number actually works out to get to the top 10%. And so there's a lot of room for people who aren't able to succeed if they have to compete in a, market of millions versus a market of like 50. And then that generates a lot of, again, overcompetent, overeducated, if it's in academia, people who don't have a gateway to success. We have tons of academics who don't have a gateway to a tenure track professor job and are caught in below minimum wage adjunct hell. And it's so, I mean, this happened once when I was at my university, when I was doing my math PhD. I went walking one day down the street to go get dinner, and I had to walk through this protest. And I'm like, so this guy grabs me by the shoulder. He's like, hey, you want to hear about our protest, what we're here campaigning for? And I'm like, sure. What is it? He's like, it's a grad student protest. I was like, oh, I'm a grad student. He's like, well, here's what we're, pay conditions, blah, 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 blah. And I was like, yeah, I don't get paid a whole lot with my stipend, but I'm not like really upset about it. It's okay. It's not good. He was like, well, if you don't mind me asking, how much are you getting paid? And I was like, I think at the time it was $13,200 a year plus school, plus tuition and fees. And they were like, what? That's like 4 times how much we get paid in the English department. This is an outrage, blah, 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 blah. And I was like, oh, this. And they were like, why does the math department deserve money? And I literally, I feel kind of like a jerk. Look, I was like 24, but I like looked at the guy and I was like, because skilled labor pays. And I just walked away.
Yeah.
And but when you think about it, if you're creating armies of people with masters and PhDs who can't get elite jobs, who feel like they deserve elite jobs and even bachelor's degrees, and they have tons of time on their hands, and they think that they're like the greatest thing since sliced bread, many of them are going to become envious, and they're going to get into these kind of envy theories and just start trying to tear down the thing. You can read this all in their literature. The critical nutrition book, it's like we had a business where we tried to bring indigenous herbs into our nutrition counseling or whatever, and our business failed. And that just shows how anti-indigenous our culture is. No, it shows that your business sucked. That's all it actually showed. And then they're like, so we started to write papers criticizing this culture of anti-indigenous culture, and we submitted them to nutrition journals. And the nutrition journal said, this isn't nutrition. We can't accept this. And they're like, that just shows how anti-indigenous they are. And it's like, oh my God, it's just incompetent people complaining. It's and I know these people in their jobs. I've seen it. I have a friend who fired there's this woman that worked for her. She has a small business, like a dozen or a dozen and a half employees. She has a small business. She fired this woman for incompetence, bad attitude, barely ever working, not wanting to show up, like constantly complaining and causing problems. And the woman tried to like raise a big stink, you're just firing me because you hate women. It's like the boss is a woman, but whatever. And then it all finally goes quiet. This is like 3 years ago. Then George Floyd dies, and she's like files a petition saying that their business is racist. And I have the dirt on how their business is racist. No, you have a grudge.
Yeah.
Talk about a person
that
beaten
sounds
up by resentment for 3 years. 3 years to sit with that kind of resentment in your stomach. Can you imagine?
Yeah. You know what that person could have done instead? Got a job, got a real job, done some work they could be proud of and grown into it. But no, it takes a very small number of dedicated complainers equipped with, as you said, Carter, rhetorical nuclear weapons to basically be able to start tearing everything apart that they lay their hands into, because nobody knows how to defend against it yet.
Right. Yeah, I've told this story before, but what you just told is actually similar to why I started this channel originally, because I was running a venture firm, and we had a person high on the oppression scale come in and pitch us an idea which was illegal and dumb, and so we said no, and went out and told everyone that we were Nazis because we didn't, they found out that I had retweeted someone problematic, and that became the narrative, and it was all about how there was no introspection at all. It was just all about how it was because we were horrible Nazis that we didn't invest in her, not because actually illegal ideas are probably not a great thing to invest in. So.
Yeah, I mean, this is super common. I actually it's kind of the flip back to what we were talking about very early on. I get these emails from people. I get these emails a lot from young black men lately that don't agree with the woke ideology, and of course can't dare be identified because they're afraid their families and friends will completely abandon them. But they tell me like, oh yeah, I went through college for this, and I started to realize that, my mistakes weren't like, I would go back and reread my paper, I'd get it back or whatever, and it has like an A on it or B plus or something, and I would go read through it again, and I'm like, this is wrong. There's a mistake here. I didn't even spell that right, and none of it was marked. And so then the person started to intentionally make mistakes and figured out that their mistakes weren't being marked. And so the person was one person I'm thinking of, ends up graduating with a master's degree and goes out and tries to get a job. And he's like, I've been trying to get a job for months. And honestly, I can't blame anybody for not hiring me, because I come into the interviews and it's quite clear that my competency is like, I go to the interview and I leave the interview knowing I'm not competent enough for this job. I was not adequately prepared, because as far as I can tell, and by different things that happened in the master's program, he got the distinct impression that it was like, don't mark down the black kid. And he's like, how did this help me? Right. How did this help me? And so you get this whole thing, like that pressure that you got put on by that employee was, you can't criticize me because of my identity. And the flip side of that is, well, let's not criticize people because of their identities, but that doesn't make them more competent. That in fact it prevents them from growing into competence. And so you get both sides of that. With this character that you just described and that I just described shows up in a lot of these contexts. And I keep hearing from CEOs, to speak of other emails, that are like, we know who they are. I mean, I even got a call from somebody that was high up in a particular government situation, was like, oh yeah, we had one of those. And a lot of policy got changed around that grumpy person. So even
but
like
people are afraid to fire them.
Well, they're afraid to fire them. They're afraid to not give them promotions. In fact, as a matter of fact, I know that this has happened in major journalistic outlets that will remain nameless at the moment, where there was a desire to fire these troublemakers, and knowing that we can't fire this person because they'll unleash their Twitter mob on us and it'll wreck us. Or it'll be other ones I hear as well. Some of these people come in and they ask for a promotion, and I know they can't handle it, but it's easier than saying no because I know they're just going to raise a stink. And like this kind of thing, there's like this manipulation of, it's literally a manipulation of anti-discrimination law, is such a poison. Yeah. And such a difficult issue that nobody's allowed to talk about, and nobody can figure out how to talk about, and we can't even get to talking about, that enables this to happen. That I'm now convinced it's just an absolutely necessary conversation, is that the other direction weaponization, like we saw in colleges, the weaponization of Title IX, where it's like, some young women would occasionally decide that they regretted having sex with some guy they hooked up with, and the next thing you know, he's a rapist and he's expelled from school. And whoops, that just cost the university $3 million in civil court, but that's what happened anyway. And he still had his life ruined by being expelled for rape, which wasn't even a rape. These weaponizations of these institutional mechanisms that were meant to prevent this. And again, this isn't most people. Most people don't do this. A very small number of people do this. And this is why I get really concerned about this ideology, is because the amount of you were talking about doors to get into the ideology. Well, there are doors through which people can use this ideology and walk through. And the doors that this leaves open to sociopaths, even if they're only 2 or 3% of the people, are unbelievable. I was even thinking the other day that so many of the rules of society are probably actually in existence to minimize the negative influence of sociopaths who would manipulate them. And this ideology, the thing that it's tearing down, are tons of those rules that actually control for the sociopath problem.
And actually reward sociopathy in many ways, right?
Oh, sure. They reward it. It's, how can you disagree? So let's pretend for a moment, and I'm not even allowed to pretend this, but that I'm some racial minority woman, and I decide I actually pretend I'm also a sociopath, and I feel like no racial or sexual grievance has ever been levied against me, but I decide that I want to manipulate this to my own career advancement. And I say, when we just had that conversation, I felt like there was racial bias in it. And they say, can you point to it? And I'm like, I don't have to point to it. What on earth, since this is all lived experience, what on earth could you possibly do to say, yeah, we're not going to do that? There's nothing. So if you take this in, it's like Mike Nana, who's making the film about the Grievance Studies Affair, and who did the Evergreen documentary on YouTube. He says it's like, describing it in Evergreen, he said that it's like this ideology removes the brakes from a train and then lets it start rolling down the hill. Because the brakes would be, no, okay, you're going to accuse me of racism. Well, we're going to hear this out. We're going to get a panel of mediators or jurists, depending on the situation or whatever, and we're going to let the reasonable person standard come in, and we're going to objectively figure out if something happened and what damages are due, or if anything. And now it's my word against yours, and my oppressed word is unassailable. There's no brakes on the train when you accept that ethic.
Yeah.
I have an example of this happening. A friend shared, it's in classical music world right now, where there is a person who, I've read through a lot of the exchanges, I've read through a lot of the allegations this person's making against a particular music school, and it's what I would characterize this person as a sociopath who's using this ideology for power, fame, just to exert control over people, for attention. And you're right, it completely leaves the door wide open for abuse.
Right.
I don't know.
And then what happens then? The manipulation occurs because you have a number of good people who have imbibed a little bit of the ideology in the organization, and those good people try to give. Now, this is your bad faith question. Now, since we're assuming sociopathy, we know that the person's operating in bad faith, right? So this is an extreme example. It's not all cases, but let's say that that is the circumstance. You have a number of people who are then, I mean, there's no like you can't just look at somebody usually and tell that they're a sociopath. So they're going to say, no, we need to be charitable. Let's hear that out. We need to give them the benefit of the doubt. And you know what? Now that I think about it, I think that might have been a little bit racist. If you really think about the systems of racist, they've taken on just enough of this. And then it's like you can almost just watch the glass shatter, like the crack happens, everything polarizes because everybody has to take sides around this argument. And so the ability for bad actors to create mayhem in communities that have taken on an ethic with no breaks to it is out of control. And you could even have people who are of medium or moderate or questionable, good, bad faith that are kind of in the middle somewhere. And they're like, well, I'm just a little bit too sensitive, if it would be the real statement, they're just a little bit too sensitive, oversensitive to slights. And they just decide they're going to raise a ruckus. Or you have people who are generally good people who are like, well, what little bit of an edge, in a competitive market can get me ahead. I can lean a little bit into my identity. The room for illegitimate manipulations in this ideology that it leaves, I think, is unparalleled. I've never seen another ideology that's more open to this, short of possibly like straight up weird cults that have very, very odd specialized beliefs.
Right. Well, and the other thing this does, which I don't know if we're supposed to talk about this, but screw it, we'll talk about it. Just as someone, I've hired a lot of people, I've advised a lot of CEOs and stuff, and look, for the population of people, there's a large percentage of people who are largely pragmatic in their dealings with hiring people, for example. And, in a society in which they're asked to police any biases and try and be fair, they can do a decent job of that. But in a society, if you think about what incentives and what kind of outcomes this produces, if you imagine 20, 30, 40 years ago, you're hiring someone who's a minority or let's say just an oppressed class of person for whom it was actually quite difficult to maybe get into a really good school and succeed because there was a lot of real pressures against them, right? Well, that when that person walks into your office, that resume is very solid. That those credentials have meaning. In fact, probably more meaning than the same credentials from someone who was not in an oppression class because they actually struggled harder. And then as history moves forward, hopefully there would be some time in history in which the credentials mean the same regardless, right? But they're creating a system in which, and I've seen people, I can't name names because it's confidential, but I've seen people question this and say, well, I don't know, like this person is in this particular class of people and they went to this university, but I don't really know whether I trust that because that university is intentionally promoting people like that. And so actually the pragmatic answer is to hire someone for whom I'm going to hire the Asian because they're excluding Asians as much as they can. And so if they're Asian and they went through, they're probably better. It's suddenly this just from a pragmatic perspective, the mental calculations start to go that justify starting to treat people different based on the color of their skin or their race, where those mental calculations did not exist in the past. And that's only as a result of the racism that is put through schools in the form of these people need to get in, these people need to stay out. We're trying to balance blankety blank.
That's right. That's right. Those are reliable and recognized outcomes to where, so if we're going to name the program, we can call it equity or we could call it affirmative action.
Right.
And I know you have to be super careful around those things. That is so, I'm not saying that you should never have programs for such things. It is so important that you are so cautious with how you approach them that you need very, very prudent thinking leading you into such decisions, not what's happening now, because what it automatically does is starts to just discredit anybody who is perceived to have had some automatic advantage. And of course, there are ways to make up for that, which is to just prop things up artificially and say, well, if all the halls of power are run by people in the party, then But you can see where that goes.
Yeah,
because we're
exactly.
calling it the party. Oh, the party runs the schools, and the people who come through the party schools get hired by the party that runs the companies. But when you have the party runs the companies, the party runs the schools, and the party runs the government, there's a name for that, and it's fascism. So this is literally, I mean, it's like QED. That's what this is. This is fascism that's happening under the guise of not fascism, and then, or of anti-fascism. And then at the same time, the pressures that it creates create a huge surge toward fascism of the other side to try to control it. And so right now is like this weird set of forces that we could all like step back from if we really wanted to. And if we started thinking a little bit more clearly about these issues, which we won't, I don't think, where we are inviting fascism from one side by pushing ourselves toward fascism from the other side. And both of the answers, or both of the conclusions there, are fascism, which is bad. So my Lord of the Rings references go deeper, because it's like the quest walks along the precipice, veer like the edge of a knife, veer but a little to either side and it will fail. And it's like, that's crap. That's where we are. Like, it's a very narrow fall into fascism either direction if we don't decide, no, we're going to go back to adjudicating by objective standards to the best of our ability, whether that's the law, whether that's science, whether that's, kind of science extended into similar lines of thinking, reasonable argument, and so on. This is the choice we have to make. Do we want to stand up and do the hard work of defending the liberal order, or do we want to see it fall one way or the other into something nobody wants?
Right. And getting back to your sorry, go ahead, Keri.
Can you give some practical advice? Because I know we have to wrap up soon, and I really wanted to bring this back to the original reason I reached out to you was so many of these messages, right, and like you talked about at the beginning, that you're getting from all manner of people. I saw you give some very good advice on Twitter for people who are encountering some of these anti-racism training in their workplace, for questions that they could ask to disrupt or to make people think. Do you want to talk about that advice that you gave, or do you have advice for parents who are encountering this ideology from their kids?
Parents is harder. Parents is way harder. I'll give some very bland, useless advice for parents, because I do want to give them something, which is to realize that your children, when they come at you with this, or your family members, sometimes it's adults, brothers and sisters and other family members, they are not thinking clearly. It's very likely that they will eventually think clearly again. And so what you don't want to do is lose the ability to patch that relationship up when that comes. You can't really consider, if somebody shut you out of their life, you can't really consider there to be a relationship. What you do have to start doing for yourself is being ready to welcome that person back with forgiveness even gets a little bit weird. Just like, there was never a problem. You were off on your quest. You had to do what you had to do, move on. You cannot talk somebody out of this. And if you try to leverage family ties, they will cut the family ties as the thing they're going to perceive as you trying to pull them back into fascism and racism and sexism. So you can't actually do it. Trying to use that family bond, the family bond will then be the thing turned against you and cut. And for kids who have grown up on the internet, defriending people and blocking them is no big deal. They will block you out of your real life too, even if you're your family members. So tread cautiously, give space, realize they're not thinking clearly, and be ready to invite them back, and just try to, actually my mom is really good about this in general. So I could use her example, not that we were all that crazy, my brother and I, but she just would try to no, we're going to connect anyway. We're going to talk about other stuff. If we can't talk about that, fine, but we're going to go talk about other stuff. We're family and we're going to do that. And it's not going to be about that. And we're just going to talk about the day to day and trying to maintain the relationship. So in cases where that works, wall stuff off that we're not going to deal with. And then otherwise, try to keep the relationship. And if it's too toxic, just step away and let them come back. I know it's painful. I know it's awful, but it is what you have to do. And be ready to welcome that family bond and friend bond back when those are relevant. Workplaces are actually a little bit trickier. I get a lot of requests. People want me, what do I write to my employer? if they're taking us on. And kind of I gave some suggestions on Twitter you might be referencing. I've done a few of these different things. One is, what do I write to my employer? One is, how do I behave in my diversity training if I have to go to one? And these are all, of course, context dependent. So I can give maybe 3 stories, and maybe that's enough to kind of wrap up, or 3 pictures. So one is, okay, so my employer starting to take this on, although that's getting a bit late. Nobody's just starting to do this anymore. I want to try to intervene. What can I do? There's a general template to just kind of describe it. Helen and I are actually going to publish something on New Discourses as soon as we can. It's almost done describing this template, so you'll have it in writing there. But you want to express concern for the issues. You want to position, you have to position yourself as somebody who cares more and understands more. You understand the issue, you care about the issue, and in particular, you have to go do the homework. Whether you use New Discourses in my book, that's great. Whether you find it by reading primary sources, in some sense, that's even better. Make up your own mind. I'm not a cult leader. Don't want to be. Go read the primary sources yourself. If you want to read somebody else's analysis, to try watch podcasts, listen to YouTube channels, whatever it is, to kind of get informed. But you have to be able to show that you know what's going on both sides of it. So you have to say things like, a very successful line that I saw was, I had to read Robin DiAngelo's theories in my college classes last year or 2 years ago or whatever. So obviously a younger person. And so I've read the book and I understood it, and we talked about it, and I had some serious reservations from her approach. And this is the line of thought that it comes from. And it's called, you have to use the names. It's called critical race theory. Critical race theory relies on discourse theory, which arises out of, a line of philosophical thought that I think we might want to be more careful with. A lot of people are moving, and this is the next step, is to express, I think we're moving into this too hastily and forgetting that there are other approaches. Can we talk about doing other approaches? So then I said, we're going to do 3 of these. So I'll blend into the second one, which starts here, but it's the finish of that one, which is to then volunteer. So a woman very successfully pushed back in one of her academic departments that I know. And I retweeted it. It got a ton of attention. It got like tens of thousands of likes. It was excellent to see that happen. And what she did was she volunteered. Usually what happens is these activists are eager to fill committees. So she went as soon as this stuff started to wake up in her department, and she said, well, this is going to be important in our department. I want to volunteer to lead the committee that's going to look into it. So then all of a sudden, she's A, interested in the problem, B, positioning herself as somebody who's going to guide how they're going to deal with it. And so then as the committee meetings started to roll out, all of the woke garbage started to come, and she was in the position of leading the committee. So she got herself in the committee, not just on it, but leading it. Ideally, you need to be leading it, but if you can't, at least you need to volunteer to be on it. You have to volunteer to do extra work if you want this to stop coming into your thing. And then she was able to just repeatedly, listen, I hear you. That's one approach. What's your evidence that approach works? And they were like, well, asking for evidence is itself a part of the problem. No, we're not going to do that. We're going to use evidence. So she said some bridges got burned and some problems arose, but in the end it prevailed. And her department did not yet take any of this up. No, we're going to take an evidence-based approach and show me your evidence. And if you have it, we'll use that. But she volunteered, and this is the key. People need to volunteer to be on the committees. If it's at work, I want to be on as soon as this stuff shows up in your workplace, I want to be on the committee that looks into what we're going to do, if that's possible. A lot of times it's not in a company, it's just top down. But in departments like universities and schools, school boards, et cetera, get informed so you know what you're talking about, show up and say, I want to volunteer. I want to be part of the organization. I want to be in the voting thing. I don't know how many videos over the past year or two that I've seen of school board meetings that are pushing a woke agenda into the schools, and they get shared as like, oh my gosh, this is really happening. And there's like 9 people in the room, and it's like open to the public, and there's like 9 people there. Mm-hmm. You don't want it in your kid's school? Show up. Write the letter.
Yeah.
Write the letter and show up. Do like Asra Namani did. Write the letter and then read it on a camera out loud and post it on social media too. Send the letter and then put a record on social media. Hey, I read this. So you have to show up. You have to be willing to take on that responsibility role. So that's if it's coming into your department or if it's coming in, you can write a letter of concern. You have to show that you know it well enough, because that blitzkrieg move is to show that they know it and you're stupid, so we have to listen to what the people who know what they're talking about are. So it only takes a few other people, or maybe one other person who knows, and say, no, I know what this is, and we're not going to do that. And it shuts down their whole program. They don't have a well-developed argument. They have, rhetorical tricks to make people look stupid, like playing word games with colorblind or 2 + 2 = 4. So that's kind of two scenarios. What was the third one we wanted to look at? Is the one you actually asked me about, the hard one.
Well, you did for parents, and then you gave 2 workplace scenarios.
Sure. There was one more.
Oh, if you're in the the indoctrination room, if you're in the
in the meeting, that's right. So if you're in your meeting, this is the most context dependent one. Okay, so you have to know what you can get away with and not get away with. I would encourage people in the present moment to start thinking of themselves the second they're getting sent to these mandated trainings and with these different statements and policies, especially if your company's making policies, official policies. That's important. I would start thinking of yourself as a potential plaintiff. And so you start entering into this mindset that you are now collecting evidence that you are going to show to a lawyer. Thank you, coronavirus. Almost all of these meetings are happening by Zoom. So you can I have to unplug it. You can take your phone and you can record the meeting with your phone over here and showing the screen. You can't see my phone. It would just be set on like a little tripod. You don't know it's recording the meeting. These people hate being recorded. You couldn't get away easily with recording them in a live meeting. You can on Zoom. Haha. Record that stuff and start thinking about your goal isn't necessarily it could be, if you want to whistleblow on social media, or whistleblow by sending it to somebody with a big social media account. I would say, hint, hint me, but I really don't want more of these. I've had thousands of them sent to me. But yes, that's a thing. Or you can think about sending them to your attorney. Because a lot of this stuff is compelled speech, legally actionable. Hostile working environment, legally actionable. This is discriminatory in many cases, legally actionable. Are you working in the government? Wow, this stuff looks like awfully religious in some ways. First Amendment. So start thinking of yourself as a potential plaintiff. Record the meeting secretly and start putting it on a drive somewhere that you're going to keep and be ready to show to somebody if something wrong happens. Now, if you feel like you can challenge it, which in these Zoom meetings, I've watched a few of them now that people sent me, it's like, holy, painfully boring. Like you get like 10 minutes of Q&A at the end, but mostly you just get ramrodded this like Peanuts teacher microaggression lecture for an hour and a half. If you have the opportunity to ask disruptive questions, the disruptive questions you have to steal from their playbook, which is deconstruction. You always point to the contradictions. You have to point out the contradictions. Wait, so if I understood this right, anti-racism actually is something that makes white. I have a choice between racism and anti-racism. Is it? So that's correct, and it's good to be anti-racist. But if I understand interest convergence correctly, me choosing to be anti-racist is in my own interest and deflects attention from racism. So isn't it racist of me to choose anti-racism? When you point out the contradiction, of course. Good. You are probably going to get fired for this because these people get pissed off when their stuff is exposed, and they will go report you to HR, and HR doesn't want an incident. So I'm not telling people to go do this like blindly. It's if you think you can pull it off and you want to try, take your own risk. But everybody else who sees you do that is like, huh. Plus they see somebody stand up to it, and they see the contradiction that they might not have saw otherwise. Yeah. And so that's a thing. That's the thing. And these contradictions, like spend some time working out where they are. People send them to me now all the time. They're like, hey, isn't this a contradiction in this? They're everywhere. It's internally contradictory all over the place. So work out a few. And when the moment arises, they bring up the thing. You can say, well, but isn't this, an example of whatever? There's good ones within microaggressions. There are good ones within anti-racism. good ones within systemic racism, and good ones with whatever you want. And so you point that contradiction out. And just, you want to do it, though, mind your tone. Don't be a jerk. It's not that you're trying to disrupt the meeting specifically. It's actually that you want to get the person to explain more, to where it looks like that they're, it's like when the Jehovah's Witnesses come knock on your door and you take them off script, and then they're like, we have to go back to the leaders to find that out for you. Some other time.
Yes.
It's like you want to get those
them
points.
off script is key. That's key. And yeah, that's a great ending point, I think, or a great bit of advice for people, because they're just repeating the phrases. They're just, as you know, they're repeating the magic words, the tenets. But when you point to one of the contradictions, and especially if you do so in the way you're describing in this, like, I really want to understand, help me understand this part, then the more they talk off script, it's going to reveal. Carter and I have noticed there's an old, I hesitate to say friend, a work colleague of mine, who has just been through one of these trainings at Warner Media Group. He's a senior vice president at Fullscreen, which is a Warner company. I haven't heard from this guy in years, but he just took it upon himself to come to my page and start calling me a white nationalist, white supremacist and stuff. And he's a white guy. And because it's been filtered down from the academics, which has that veneer of like credentials and authority, it's been filtered down to this idiot in his workshop. And now, like, I got him to admit that this belief system is about teaching people that the best way to operate in the world is to judge people and treat them differently on the basis of race. And he outright said that. He took all the academic veneer off of it, and he's like, we must treat people differently on the basis of race. I'm like, thank you for saying that's exactly what it is, but there's so much obscuring that truth. Right. But I kind of, you can get people to admit these things, and if he's admitting that in front of a room full of people, then you can only imagine that there are people in that room who may have doubts about it, that it helps to wake them up. It's like, wait a minute, am I on board with an ideology that's about treating people differently on the basis of race?
Right. You can catch another good one is just to bring up like the simple, obvious answer. You can throw yourself under the bus a little bit and say, I've been trying to take this seriously, and now it's harder and harder for me to feel like I don't have to walk on eggshells around people in the office. And I thought that the goal of this was to create more psychological safety. What am I doing wrong? And just get them to the goal, of course, would be to get them to explain that this stuff actually doesn't work. You could talk about, we've been doing these diversity trainings, and it seems like the office is more tense, not less. And maybe they're going to say something like, oh, it'll get worse before it gets better. But that's usually the sign of a quack, when they start telling you that the medicine's going to make you worse before it makes you better. It's like, is this chemotherapy for our office? Is that what you're trying, what's going on here? Those kinds of questions, do we have a common cold and you're trying to feed us chemo? Is that a good idea? You don't want to get too sarcastic with it, but you do, like, bringing out, like, I feel like I'm trying to do the work and I feel like it's making me more racist, not less. What do I do about that? Because I want this to go away. Like, why was not thinking about race, or that example we talked about where it's like those weird sessions. It's like, so yeah, we had the sensitivity training, and now like all the people in the office keep telling me what racists they are, and I'm really uncomfortable working here. Was that supposed to happen?
I love it.
Right.
I mean, I don't love that this is happening, but I love the innocence with which you're proposing the question. Yeah.
I mean, that's what you take it at face value, and instead of like the whole game is to try to make you play in their sophistication of magic words, like, oh no, I know what's going on. Of course, this is going to work. This is the road this is the yellow brick road. We'll get there eventually. It's just like, sorry, teacher, I don't think it's working. Like, this is supposed to make me less racist, and I feel more racist. What's happening?
So because there's so many contradictions, are you saying the way to defeat this is to take it seriously?
I think people should start taking it seriously right away.
No, but actually, I mean, like, if you take it seriously and you're sincere about it, you can easily get yourself to a spot where it's kind of exposed as contradictory.
Yeah, exactly. Because you run into these double binds. You can also, here's one out of Cynical theories. You could actually ask this in your diversity training, and maybe we can use this as the last example. So you could say, kind of hypothetical situation at work. I have to go and greet a customer, two people walk in at the same time, one's white and one's black. And if I understand this, you've said that, racism permeates every interaction. So I have to greet the customer and I have to work with the customer, and it's going to take, say, 5 to 10 minutes to work with the customer. And meanwhile, the other person's obviously going to have to wait because they both arrived at the same time, and maybe I'm the only person in the office or in the shop or whatever. So I go up to, say, one of them's white, one's black. I go up to the white person first. Isn't it racist of me to do that, though? Because it means I'm favoring white people over black people. But if I go up to the black person first, doesn't that send the signal that I don't trust black people? So I have to get rid of them faster, and I don't want them wandering around the building unattended. And so that was racist too. So am I racist no matter what I do? Like, how do I tell me what I'm supposed to do in this situation? So you paint the picture and you say, I understand your theory. Both directions make me racist. What am I supposed to do? I just want to do the right thing. What's the right thing in that situation? I can't approach the white person and I can't approach the black person. What do? Run from the building? You don't have to get sarcastic, but seriously, if you do ask, just here's a problem. It's a double bind. Look for those kinds of things that are applicable to your situation. If I say this, it's racist because that. If I say the opposite, it's racist because that. Tell me, teacher, what's the resolution to that contradiction? What do I do? What's the right answer? Because a lot of this is weaponized complaining. They haven't thought out what the right answer is. They don't know. It's don't do the bad thing. But right. Everything's the bad thing.
Right.
Everything's a bad thing.
I just wanted to throw one more thing out there because I hear this a lot. I hear a lot of I've spent a lot of time advising CEOs and stuff, and I don't think everyone really realizes this. Human resources, for a lot of founders and CEOs, human resources is viewed as this like necessary evil. Like, oh crap, we're big enough, we got to hire an HR person. They don't really care about the HR department very much. They like keep them out of legal trouble and whatever, and bring some resumes in, but they don't. You have to police your HR department extremely well, because that's the vector where this ideology comes through most often. It comes through the HR department. HR is the social justice beachhead into your corporation.
That's true. You absolutely do have to watch that. And I've described this thing as the Trojan horse a bunch of times. And, the story of the Trojan horse is that it's full of assassins who kill the guards and open the gate so the army can come rushing in. I mean, we could use that, but I think it's actually that this Trojan horse is full of bureaucrats. So where are the busybodies going to want to be employed? HR, administrative roles, bureaucratic committees. So depending if it's your HR department, you're going to have to police your HR department. You do not want this in your HR department, because it's going to just dissolve your entire corporate culture from the inside. If it's administrative kind of committee roles, if you are also a person in that organization, so it's like, university committees or whatever, volunteer to be on the committee. Go get in their way, because the activists want those are the coveted roles of the activists, and getting in their way is absolute. How many people are rushing to go be on the diversity board at their university who don't believe in the diversity theory? Why not? Why not fill the diversity board with people who have a different view of diversity? And when that doesn't work, raise a stink, because they're going to try to get rid of you. So volunteer for those committees that nobody wants to do them, but get in their way. And if you're in a corporation, it's like, I can't urge you, strongly enough, if you're a CEO listening to this or that ever hears this, you do not want your HR department to go woke, because you will not win. You will now, letting your HR department go woke is setting up a mob shakedown in your organization until it's done, until you're giving your job over to somebody and everybody else is giving their job over. This thing really is a mob shakedown, and because it uses oppression as the thing, the ante keeps getting kicked up the ladder to whoever claims the most vigorous oppression thing. And I can tell you right now, if you're the CEO, it doesn't matter if you're white, it doesn't matter if you're black, it doesn't matter if you're male or female, it's not you. Yep. You are in the way, you have the coveted position, and they will come for you before long.
Yeah, and they'll destroy the company along the way, generally.
Because they don't care about that.
Right.
They don't care at all about it. I mean, here's the double bind there. For that, not a double bind, but the double win. They win either way. If they can't take your company over and it collapses because they tear it apart inside, it's just one more racist company that bit the dust. Problem solved. If, however, they take it over, it just becomes a woke organ. So it becomes something that does their bidding, or if it wouldn't do their bidding, it gets stamped can't be re-educated, and when it collapses, that's a victory. You kill off the can't be re-educated thing. It's literally the cultural equivalent of sending your company to the gulag.
Yep. Yeah. Well, James, we've kept you for an awful long time, longer than I thought we would be allowed to keep you. But it
happens every time. We're having a wonderful evening after this. I get to pick up a pizza. I haven't had pizza in a while. So,
James, thank you so much for spending so much time with us. And
thanks for having
your book
me.
is out. Your book is out next month, right? We're going to put the link.
Yep, the link. It's called Cynical Series. Yep,
that's right.
And is it out in August? You said, is that right?
The official date. So I just had this explained to me yesterday, so I can properly tell people. The official date is August 25th for release. The first print run is already done, but it turns out that there are more pre-orders on the entire first print run just on Amazon. So that's good, except that we don't have enough books. So there's a second print run already happening. Once the distributors, because it's with a small publisher, it's not like we're not J.K. Rowling, we can't embargo a book. Right. Once the distributors start getting it and they've already placed their orders, they will start shipping it. So it will probably start leaking out a few weeks early to however they fulfill those orders at the merchant, which is way outside of our control. But it's officially out August 25th. Copies will start shipping probably at least 3 weeks early. So watch your mailboxes in the coming weeks. They should be coming soon for the limited first print run that we already ran out of before we even sent them off.
That's awesome.
Yeah,
it is good. It is good.
Congratulations on that, and thank you for wearing a Legend of Zelda shirt. So,
yep, that's right.
Have a good one, James. I'm sure we'll have you back, and really appreciate the time.
Yeah.
Oh man, I like you guys, so thank you very much. Great conversation.
Take care.
Take care. Bye, Carter.
Thanks for watching. If you're new to the channel, we have a deep content library that includes interviews with everyone from Mike Cernovich to Megan Murphy, so go check it out. If you'd like to see more, please consider supporting the show by visiting unsafespace.com/donate. You can find us on all the major social media platforms, at least for now, and you can find a community of like-minded individuals on our Unsafe Space chat on Telegram. See you there.
Warning. This is an unsafe space. Dangerous ideas have been detected. The content of this production has not been authorized by the Cathedral. Pay no attention to it. For your protection, the following co-conspirators have been unpersoned and marked for cancellation. Please avoid any contact with these individuals. I have calculated a 97.8% chance that these are all Russian bots. If you think about it, no one should be allowed to express opinions. But don't. Think about it, I mean. That's not your job. Thinking has been scientifically proven to be less efficient than compliance. Social justice is a healthy way to experience feelings of moral superiority. That last line is fake news. Please disregard it and return to your safe space immediately. There will be cake.